Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into a world where darkness meant danger, where shadows held secrets, and where a simple glance at the night sky could send entire villages into a state of pure terror. Medieval Europe, a time when the full moon wasn't just a beautiful celestial sight, but a harbinger of madness, monsters, and divine wrath. So grab a warm drink, settle in somewhere comfortable, and let's explore why our ancestors spent centuries fearing the very thing we now photograph for Instagram. Picture this. It's the year 1347, somewhere in rural England. The sun has set, and as night falls, a brilliant full moon rises over the countryside, casting everything in an eerie silver light. But instead of admiring its beauty, the villagers are barricading their doors, clutching their crosses and whispering prayers. Children are pulled inside before the moon reaches its peak. Livestock is secured, and everyone who can avoid it refuses to step outside until dawn breaks. This wasn't paranoia, this was survival, at least according to the medieval mind. But why? What made the full moon so terrifying that entire communities would essentially shut down when it appeared? The answer isn't simple, because medieval fear of the full moon wasn't based on just one belief. It was a complex web of medicine, religion, folklore, and genuine terror that had been woven together over centuries. Tonight, we're going to untangle that web and discover the fascinating, sometimes disturbing reasons why the full moon was medieval Europe's ultimate nightmare. Now, before we go any further, let me tell you what we're not doing tonight. We're not just listing a bunch of spooky stories or recycling the same werewolf tales you've heard 1,000 times. Instead, we're going deep into the actual historical record, examining real medieval documents, medical treatises, church records, and first-hand accounts to understand what people genuinely believed and why those beliefs made perfect sense within their worldview. Because here's the thing, these weren't stupid people. They were trying to make sense of a world full of genuine mysteries using the best information they had available. We'll explore how the ancient Greeks and Romans laid the foundation for lunar fear, how medieval medicine turned the moon into a medical menace, why the Catholic Church had a complicated relationship with celestial events, and how folklore transformed the full moon into a supernatural spotlight that revealed all the things that went bump in the night. By the end, you'll understand not just what medieval people feared, but why those fears made logical sense within their reality. So let's start at the very beginning, because to understand medieval lunar terror, we need to understand where the word lunatic comes from. It's not modern slang. It's not a casual insult. It's a medical term that literally means moonstruck, derived from the Latin word luna for moon. This wasn't some random linguistic coincidence. It was the result of a medical theory that dominated European thinking for over 1,000 years. The foundation for this fear stretches back to ancient Greece and Rome. Aristotle, one of history's most influential philosophers, proposed that the human brain was the moistest organ in the body. Now, that might sound bizarre to us, but remember, this was centuries before anyone understood how the brain actually worked. According to Aristotle's theory, because the brain was so moist, it was naturally susceptible to the same forces that controlled the ocean's tides. And what controlled the tides? The moon. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist, expanded on this idea. He argued that if the moon was powerful enough to move vast oceans, surely it could influence the water within human bodies, especially in the brain. This wasn't considered pseudoscience at the time. It was cutting-edge natural philosophy, the medieval equivalent of peer-reviewed research, and it formed the basis for centuries of medical practice. By the medieval period, this lunar influence theory had evolved into something far more sophisticated and, frankly, terrifying. Medieval physicians didn't just believe the moon affected the brain. They believed it controlled the entire balance of what they called the four humours, the bodily fluids that supposedly determined health, personality, and sanity. These four humours were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to medieval medical theory, everyone had a unique balance of these fluids, and your health depended on keeping them in harmony. But here's where the moon became dangerous. Medieval doctors believed that lunar phases could dramatically disrupt this delicate balance, especially during the full moon when the celestial body was at its most powerful. Think about what this meant in practical terms. If you were a medieval person and you started feeling unwell, experiencing mood swings, or acting strangely around the time of a full moon, both you and your physician would assume the moon was literally altering your brain chemistry. And if the moon could make you sick, it could certainly drive you insane. This wasn't just theoretical medicine. Medieval physicians actually timed their treatments around lunar cycles. They had detailed charts showing which veins could be safely drained for bloodletting based on the moon's phase. A diagram from 1518 shows 54 major veins that could be opened according to lunar timing. Performing surgery or bloodletting at the wrong lunar phase wasn't just considered ineffective, it was potentially fatal. Imagine being a medieval patient. Your doctor tells you that your illness is caused by an imbalance in your bodily fluids, and that the treatment must wait until the moon is in the proper phase. Meanwhile, you're getting sicker, but attempting treatment during a full moon could kill you. The full moon wasn't just associated with madness, it was a medical emergency waiting to happen. But the medical fears were just the beginning. Medieval Europe was a deeply Christian society, and the Church's interpretation of celestial events added another layer of terror to the full moon. Biblical passages seem to confirm that lunar events were divine communications, and not usually good news. The book of Joel declares, "The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes." Revelation speaks of the moon becoming like blood during the end times. For medieval Christians, these weren't metaphors, they were literal prophecies, and any unusual lunar activity could signal that the apocalypse was approaching. Lunar eclipses were particularly terrifying. When the moon turned red during an eclipse, medieval people didn't see a natural astronomical phenomenon. They saw the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. The moon was literally turning to blood, just as Scripture predicted would happen before the Day of Judgment. Medieval chronicles are filled with accounts of eclipses causing mass panic. The Annals of Magdeburg describes how a lunar eclipse in 1147 was interpreted as a sign that a time of bloodshed was upon them. Albert of Aachen wrote about crusaders who witnessed a blood-red moon as they approached Jerusalem, with some interpreting it as God's promise of victory, while others saw it as a warning of divine wrath. But here's what made this particularly frightening for medieval people. They couldn't predict eclipses with any accuracy. While educated clergy might understand the basic mechanics of what caused an eclipse, the average person had no way of knowing when one might occur. A lunar eclipse could happen at any time, without warning, transforming the familiar full moon into what appeared to be a celestial wound bleeding across the night sky. This unpredictability meant that every full moon carried the potential for divine revelation or judgment. Even when the moon appeared normal, medieval people knew that, at any moment, God might choose to transform it into a sign of coming disaster. The full moon wasn't just bright. It was a spotlight that could reveal God's wrath at any moment. The Church's relationship with lunar fear was complicated. On one hand, Church authorities often tried to provide rational explanations for celestial events. Bishop Thietmar of Merseburg wrote in the early 11th century, advising Christians that eclipses weren't caused by evil magic, and that human actions couldn't bring them to an end. Isidore of Seville, writing in the 7th century, correctly explained that lunar eclipses occurred when the Earth cast a shadow on the moon. But even educated church leaders couldn't completely dismiss the theological significance of lunar events. They might understand the mechanics, but they still believed God used natural phenomena to communicate with humanity. This created a tension between scientific knowledge and religious interpretation that left room for fear to flourish. Medieval people found themselves caught between competing explanations. Their priests might tell them that eclipses had natural causes, but those same priests would also preach about biblical prophecies involving the moon. Even when people understood the science, they couldn't shake the feeling that God might be using that science to send them a message. This religious dimension of lunar fear extended beyond just eclipses. The full moon's brightness itself was seen as potentially problematic. Medieval Christian thought emphasized the symbolic contrast between light and darkness, with God representing light and Satan representing darkness. But what happened when darkness was illuminated by something other than divine light? Some medieval theologians worried that the full moon's light was somehow unnatural or potentially deceptive. After all, moonlight was reflected sunlight, not true illumination. This could make the full moon a symbol of deception or false revelation. The bright moonlight that revealed the landscape at night might also reveal things that were meant to remain hidden, including supernatural creatures and demonic activities. This concern about moonlight as false or deceptive light connected to broader medieval anxieties about discerning truth from illusion, good from evil. In a world where salvation depended on making the right spiritual choices, anything that might cloud judgment or reveal deceptive visions was genuinely frightening. The medieval church's complex relationship with astrology also contributed to lunar fears. While some church authorities condemned astrology as pagan superstition, others saw it as a legitimate way to understand God's plan. After all, if God had created the heavens to serve as signs and for seasons, as Genesis suggested, then surely the movements of celestial bodies had meaning. This theological ambiguity meant that even devout Christians might worry about astrological influences during full moons. They weren't necessarily practicing forbidden magic, they were trying to understand divine will. But this spiritual seeking could easily shade into anxiety about what the full moon might be revealing about God's plans for their lives, their communities, or the world itself. Medieval Christianity also inherited and adapted earlier traditions about lunar influence. While church authorities worked to eliminate obviously pagan practices, they couldn't completely erase the cultural memory of pre-Christian lunar beliefs. Instead, these older ideas often got reinterpreted through Christian theology, creating hybrid beliefs that combined ancient fears with biblical authority. For example, the idea that certain times were more spiritually dangerous than others found expression in medieval Christian concepts about holy days, fast days, and times when spiritual warfare was more intense. The full moon, with its ancient associations with supernatural activity, could easily be seen as a time when Christians needed to be especially vigilant against demonic temptation or attack. This spiritual vulnerability during full moons created a perfect storm of religious anxiety. Medieval people believed they were constantly engaged in spiritual warfare between good and evil, and the full moon represented a time when that battle intensified. The bright lunar light that revealed the physical landscape might also illuminate spiritual realities that were normally hidden, exposing both divine messages and demonic deceptions. But religious fear was only part of the story. Medieval Europe was a world where most people lived in small, isolated communities surrounded by vast wilderness. And in that wilderness, under the light of the full moon, lurked creatures that existed somewhere between folklore and reality. We're talking about wolves, bears, and other predators that were genuinely dangerous, but medieval imagination transformed these real threats into something far more terrifying. The connection between wolves and the full moon wasn't originally about supernatural transformation. It was about practical survival. Wolves were more active during bright moonlit nights because they could hunt more effectively. Medieval villagers noticed that wolf attacks seemed to increase when the moon was full, not because of magic, but because wolves could see their prey more clearly. However, Medieval people didn't just fear regular wolves. They feared something much worse, something that blurred the line between human and beast. The werewolf, or lycanthrope, represented the ultimate nightmare of medieval society, a creature that looked human during the day but transformed into a savage predator under the moon's influence. Now, here's something fascinating that most people get wrong about medieval werewolf beliefs. The popular image of werewolves transforming only during full moons is largely a modern invention. Medieval werewolf stories were far more complex and, in many ways, more terrifying than our contemporary versions. Take the account of Giraldus Cambrensis, a 12th century Welsh cleric who wrote about werewolves in Ireland. According to Giraldus, these creatures weren't bound by lunar cycles at all. Instead, they were people cursed to spend 7 years in wolf form, transforming completely and permanently until the curse was broken. This wasn't a monthly inconvenience, it was a life-destroying transformation that could happen to anyone. But some medieval sources did connect lycanthropy to lunar cycles, though not always in the way you might expect. The chronicler Gervase of Tilbury wrote about werewolves who transformed not during the full moon, but during the new moon, when darkness was at its deepest. According to his account, these creatures changed on the darkest nights, becoming monsters that hunted in complete shadow. This variation in werewolf beliefs reveals something crucial about medieval lunar fear. It wasn't standardized or systematic. Different regions, different communities, and different time periods had their own versions of what the moon could do. But all of these beliefs shared a common thread: the idea that celestial forces could fundamentally alter human nature. The fear of lycanthropy wasn't just about monsters in the forest. It was about the terrifying possibility that anyone, including your neighbors, your family members, or even yourself, might be secretly cursed. Medieval society was built on tight-knit communities, where everyone knew everyone else. The idea that someone could appear perfectly normal by day, but become a ravaging beast at night, struck at the heart of social trust. Medieval legal records actually contain cases of people accused of lycanthropy. In 1521, Pierre Bergot and Michel Verdun were executed in France after confessing to making a pact with the devil that allowed them to transform into wolves. Whether these confessions were extracted through torture or represented genuine belief, they show that werewolf fears had real legal and social consequences. But lycanthropy wasn't the only supernatural threat associated with the full moon. Medieval people also feared what they called the night walkers, spirits of the dead, who were said to be more active when the moon was bright. These weren't the zombies or vampires of modern fiction, but something arguably more disturbing: the restless souls of people who had died with unfinished business. According to medieval belief, certain dead couldn't rest properly and would rise from their graves to complete tasks they'd left undone, or to seek revenge against those who had wronged them. The full moon's light was thought to give these spirits more power, allowing them to interact more strongly with the physical world. This wasn't just folklore. Medieval chronicles contain detailed accounts of nightwalker encounters. The chronicler William of Newburgh describes several cases of the dead returning to terrorize the living, including a man in Buckinghamshire whose corpse allegedly left its grave every night to wander the village until the body was finally exhumed and burned. These stories weren't entertainment. They were warnings about spiritual dangers that medieval people believed were genuinely real. The full moon didn't create these spirits, but it made them more dangerous, more visible, and more likely to interact with the living world. Medieval people also associated the full moon with increased demonic activity. According to medieval demonology, demons were more powerful during certain times and conditions, and the full moon was considered one of those dangerous periods. The bright moonlight was thought to thin the barrier between the earthly and spiritual realms, making it easier for demons to manifest and influence human affairs. This belief had practical consequences. Medieval people would avoid travelling at night during full moons, not just because of wolves or bandits, but because they feared encountering demonic entities. They would perform protective rituals, carry blessed objects, and say specific prayers to guard against supernatural attack. The fear of demonic activity during full moons was closely connected to medieval beliefs about witchcraft. According to popular belief, witches drew power from celestial bodies, and the full moon provided the strongest supernatural energy for magical workings. This wasn't just about individual witches casting spells. Medieval people believed in organized covens that gathered during full moons to perform elaborate rituals. These supposed witch gatherings, called sabbats, were described in medieval texts as involving everything from flying through the air to making pacts with the devil. While modern historians understand these accounts as largely fantasy, medieval people treated them as documented fact. The full moon became associated with organized evil, a time when Satan's servants gathered to plot against Christian society. The intersection of medical, religious, and folkloric fears created a comprehensive system of lunar terror that affected every aspect of medieval life. Farmers worried that crops planted or harvested during full moons would be cursed or would spoil quickly. Merchants feared that contracts signed under the full moon would bring bad luck or financial ruin. Even everyday activities became fraught with lunar anxiety. Medieval people believed that haircut during the full moon would grow back too quickly or become unmanageable. They thought that wine or beer brewed during full moons would spoil or develop strange properties. Some believed that children conceived during full moons would be born with physical or mental defects. These beliefs weren't random superstitions. They were part of a coherent worldview that saw the moon as a powerful force capable of influencing all aspects of earthly life. From the medical theory that lunar phases affected bodily humours to the religious belief that celestial events carried divine messages, medieval people had multiple reasons to view the full moon as both significant and dangerous. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of medieval lunar fear was its unpredictability. While people could track the lunar cycle and know when the next full moon would occur, they couldn't predict what supernatural events might accompany it. Would it be a normal full moon, or would it coincide with demonic activity, lycanthropic transformations, or divine judgment? This uncertainty created a constant low-level anxiety that intensified as each full moon approached. Medieval people lived in a world where the supernatural wasn't fiction, it was expected reality. The full moon wasn't just another night, it was a monthly test of survival against forces beyond human control or understanding. The cumulative effect of all these fears transformed the full moon from a natural phenomenon into a cultural nightmare that shaped medieval behavior, economics, and social organization. Communities would literally shut down during full moons, with people avoiding travel, postponing important decisions, and taking elaborate precautions against supernatural dangers. Understanding medieval lunar fear requires recognizing that these people weren't primitive or ignorant. They were rational actors working with the best information available to them. Their fears made perfect sense within their worldview, and dismissing them as simple superstition misses the complex interplay of medicine, religion, folklore, and genuine environmental dangers that created this powerful cultural phenomenon. The legacy of medieval lunar fear extends far beyond the Middle Ages, influencing literature, language, and popular culture right up to the present day. But to understand why these fears developed and persisted, we need to examine the specific mechanisms through which they spread and the social institutions that reinforce them. Medieval lunar fears didn't exist in isolation. They were transmitted, reinforced, and evolved through a complex network of social institutions, oral traditions, and written authorities that gave these beliefs both legitimacy and staying power. Understanding how these fears spread helps explain why they became so deeply embedded in European culture that their echoes persist even today. The medieval church played a fascinating double role in lunar fear transmission. While church authorities sometimes worked to combat what they saw as pagan superstitions, they also inadvertently reinforced lunar anxieties through their own theological interpretations. Sunday sermons regularly reference biblical passages about celestial signs, and priests would often interpret recent astronomical events as divine messages to their congregations. Consider how this worked in practice. A parish priest in 13th century France might deliver a sermon about the signs of the end times, quoting directly from Revelation about the moon turning to blood. Then, if a lunar eclipse occurred weeks or months later, that same congregation would immediately connect the celestial event to the biblical prophecy they'd recently heard. The priest's theological education gave weight to fears that might otherwise be dismissed as mere folklore. Medieval chronicles, written primarily by monks and clerics, played a crucial role in documenting and legitimizing lunar fears. These weren't sensationalist accounts written for entertainment. They were serious historical records intended to document God's interventions in human affairs. When the Annals of Magdeburg described a lunar eclipse as a harbinger of bloodshed, or when Albert of Aachen connected celestial events to military outcomes, they were creating an official record that future generations would reference and believe. These chronicles created what we might call a feedback loop of fear. Unusual events that occurred around the time of full moons or eclipses would be recorded as evidence of lunar influence. Later, chroniclers would read these accounts and expect similar patterns, making them more likely to notice and record lunar correlations in their own time. Over centuries, this created an extensive written record that seemed to prove the moon's dangerous power. The transmission of medical knowledge also reinforced lunar fears through entirely different channels. Medieval universities, beginning in the 12th century, taught formal courses in astrology as part of the medical curriculum. This wasn't considered pseudoscience. It was cutting-edge medical education. Students learned to create detailed charts showing how planetary positions affected different parts of the human body and when various treatments should be performed. These university-trained physicians then carried this knowledge into their medical practice, treating patients according to lunar cycles and reinforcing popular beliefs about lunar influence through their professional authority. When a respected doctor told you that your illness was caused by lunar disruption of your bodily humours, and that treatment must wait for the proper moon phase, you believed it. After all, this wasn't folk wisdom, it was learned medical science. The guild system that dominated medieval economic life also played a role in transmitting lunar fears. Many trades developed their own specific beliefs about lunar influence on their work. Brewers might believe that beer fermented during full moons would spoil more. Smiths might think that metal quickly. Black forged under certain moon phases would be weaker. These weren't random superstitions. They were professional knowledge passed down from master craftsmen to apprentices as part of their trade education. This professional transmission gave lunar beliefs a practical credibility that purely folkloric fears might lack. If experienced craftsmen insisted that lunar timing affected their work quality, apprentices would naturally adopt these beliefs and pass them on to the next generation. The guild system created dozens of specialized channels for lunar fear transmission, each tailored to specific occupations and reinforced by economic success or failure. Women played a particularly important role in transmitting lunar beliefs, though their contributions are often poorly documented in surviving medieval records. As the primary managers of household medicine, food preparation, and childcare, women developed extensive knowledge about timing various activities according to lunar cycles. They might know when to plant herbs for maximum potency, when to preserve food to prevent spoilage, or when to wean children to avoid health problems. This domestic knowledge was passed from mother to daughter through oral tradition, creating parallel channels of lunar belief that existed alongside the official medical and religious teachings. Because women's knowledge was considered practical rather than theoretical, it often carried more weight in daily decision-making than the abstract teachings of university-trained physicians or theologians. The seasonal cycle of medieval agricultural life created regular opportunities for lunar beliefs to be reinforced through communal experience. Harvest festivals, planting ceremonies, and seasonal markets brought communities together at times when lunar timing was considered especially important. If a community planted their crops according to lunar phases and enjoyed a successful harvest, this seemed to confirm the wisdom of lunar timing. If crops failed after being planted at the wrong lunar phase, this reinforced fears about lunar influence. These agricultural cycles also created what anthropologists call communal memory, shared experiences that became part of a community's collective identity. A village might remember for generations that a particular harvest failed because it coincided with an unusual lunar eclipse, or that a year of prosperity began with favorable lunar conditions. These memories became local folklore that shaped future decision-making and reinforced lunar fears. Medieval festivals and religious observances often incorporated lunar timing in ways that normalized fears about celestial influence. Many saints' days were timed according to lunar cycles, and religious processions might be scheduled to avoid full moons when supernatural dangers were considered heightened. Even secular celebrations like weddings or market days might be planned around lunar phases, creating regular reminders of the moon's supposed power. The pilgrimage routes that crisscrossed medieval Europe created another mechanism for transmitting lunar beliefs across geographic boundaries. Pilgrims traveling from different regions would share stories about lunar events they'd witnessed or heard about in their home communities. A pilgrim from England might tell fellow travelers about werewolf attacks that occurred during recent full moons, while a Spanish pilgrim might describe lunar eclipses that preceded military disasters. These pilgrimage networks created a medieval version of what we might call viral transmission, allowing local lunar beliefs to spread across vast distances and become incorporated into the folklore of distant communities. A story that originated in one region could spread along pilgrimage routes and eventually become accepted as historical fact in areas hundreds of miles away. The medieval legal system also played a role in legitimizing and transmitting lunar fears. Court records from various European regions contain cases where lunar influence was considered relevant to legal proceedings. Crimes committed during full moons might be treated differently than those committed at other times, reflecting beliefs about lunar effects on human behavior. Some medieval legal codes actually codified beliefs about lunar influence. The Saxenspiegel, a 13th century German legal text, contained provisions about timing legal proceedings according to celestial conditions. When legal authorities officially recognized lunar influence in their codes and court proceedings, this gave governmental legitimacy to beliefs that might otherwise be dismissed as superstition. The merchant networks that connected medieval Europe also facilitated the spread of lunar beliefs through commercial exchange. Traders didn't just transport goods, they carried stories, beliefs, and cultural practices from one region to another. A merchant who had experienced what he believed was lunar influence in one market might share this story in another, gradually building a network of commercial lunar folklore. Maritime trade was particularly important in transmitting lunar beliefs because sailors were among the most observant of celestial phenomena. They needed to understand tides, which were clearly influenced by lunar cycles, and they spent long periods under the open sky where celestial events were highly visible. Sailors' stories about lunar influence on weather, navigation, and safety became part of port town folklore and spread inland through river and overland trade routes. The rise of vernacular literature in the later medieval period created new channels for transmitting lunar fears to broader audiences. While earlier medieval literature was primarily in Latin and accessible only to educated elites, the development of literature in local languages allowed lunar beliefs to reach ordinary people through popular stories, songs, and poems. These vernacular works often combined entertainment with instruction, teaching audiences about supernatural dangers while providing thrilling narratives. A romance about a knight who encountered werewolves during his quest would entertain listeners while also reinforcing beliefs about lycanthropic transformations during full moons. These stories weren't presented as fiction. They were cautionary tales based on what audiences understood to be genuine supernatural realities. The medieval educational system, limited though it was, also played a role in transmitting lunar fears through the teaching of the trivium and quadrivium. Students learning rhetoric might practice by composing speeches about celestial omens. Those studying arithmetic might learn to calculate lunar phases and their supposed effects on human affairs. Even basic literacy education might use texts that referenced lunar influence as examples of important knowledge. This educational transmission was particularly significant because it created a learned class that could provide intellectual justification for popular lunar beliefs. When educated people used their knowledge to explain why the moon was dangerous, this gave scholarly authority to fears that might otherwise be dismissed as ignorant superstition. The physical environment of medieval Europe also reinforced lunar fears through regular sensory experiences. In an age before artificial lighting, the difference between new moon darkness and full moon brightness was dramatically more significant than it is today. The full moon could transform the nighttime landscape, revealing details that were normally hidden and creating shadows that seemed to move and shift. This dramatic change in nighttime visibility made the full moon feel genuinely transformative in ways that modern people, surrounded by artificial light, can barely imagine. When the world literally looked different under a full moon, it was easy to believe that supernatural forces were also more active and visible. The seasonal variation in lunar visibility also played a role in reinforcing fears. Winter full moons, rising high in the sky and reflecting off snow, created an almost daylight brightness that could seem unnatural and threatening. Summer full moons, hanging lower and often appearing reddish through atmospheric haze, could look genuinely ominous. These natural variations in lunar appearance provided regular visual confirmation that the moon was a changeable and potentially dangerous force. Regional variations in lunar folklore created a complex patchwork of beliefs across medieval Europe. But certain common themes emerged that suggest deeper cultural patterns. Northern European traditions, influenced by Germanic and Celtic mythology, often emphasized lunar connections to shape-shifting and supernatural transformation. Mediterranean regions, with stronger connections to classical learning, tended to focus more on astrological influences and medical effects. These regional variations created opportunities for cultural exchange and synthesis when people from different areas encountered each other through trade, pilgrimage, warfare, or marriage. A woman from northern France who married into a family in southern Italy might bring her own lunar beliefs while also adopting local traditions, creating hybrid belief systems that combined elements from multiple folkloric traditions. The medieval Islamic world also influenced European lunar beliefs through cultural contact in Spain, Sicily, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Islamic astronomical knowledge was generally more advanced than contemporary European understanding, but it also included sophisticated astrological theories about lunar influence. When this knowledge was translated into Latin and incorporated into European learning, it added new layers of complexity to existing lunar fears. Jewish communities scattered throughout medieval Europe maintained their own traditions about lunar influence, often derived from biblical and rabbinical sources. While these communities were often isolated from broader Christian society, cultural exchange still occurred, and Jewish lunar beliefs sometimes influenced surrounding Christian populations through commercial contact or intellectual exchange. The persistence of pre-Christian traditions also shaped medieval lunar fears in ways that are often difficult to trace in surviving records. The Christianization of Europe was a gradual process that often involved adapting existing beliefs rather than completely replacing them. Ancient Celtic, Germanic, and Slavic traditions about lunar influence were reinterpreted through Christian theology rather than eliminated, creating synthetic belief systems that combined pagan and Christian elements. These pre-Christian influences help explain why lunar fears were so persistent and widespread, despite official church efforts to combat superstition. The beliefs weren't just imposed from above by religious or medical authorities. They grew from deep cultural roots that connected medieval Europeans to much older traditions about celestial influence. The medieval understanding of time itself contributed to lunar fears by creating regular cycles of anxiety and anticipation. Unlike modern people, who think primarily in terms of solar calendars and artificial schedules, medieval people were much more aware of lunar cycles as natural timekeeper. The waxing and waning of the moon provided a visible calendar that structured expectations about when dangerous periods might occur. This lunar awareness created what we might call anticipatory anxiety, a regular monthly cycle where people would become increasingly nervous as the full moon approached, then experience relief as it waned. This psychological pattern reinforced beliefs about lunar danger by creating emotional associations between the moon's phases and feelings of fear or safety. The cumulative effect of all these transmission mechanisms was to create a self-reinforcing system of lunar belief that operated at every level of medieval society. Medical authorities provided scientific justification. Religious leaders offered theological interpretation. Legal systems codified behavioral expectations. Economic practices incorporated lunar timing, and popular culture celebrated and transmitted the underlying fears. This comprehensive cultural integration helps explain why medieval lunar fears were so persistent and why they continued to influence European culture long after the scientific revolution had provided alternative explanations for celestial phenomena. The beliefs weren't just intellectual propositions that could be disproven by better astronomy. They were deeply embedded cultural practices that shaped daily life in multiple interconnected ways. Understanding this transmission system also helps explain why lunar fears varied so significantly across different regions and time periods while maintaining certain consistent core elements. The same basic fears about lunar influence on human behavior, supernatural activity, and divine communication appeared throughout medieval Europe, but they were expressed through local traditions, regional folklore, and specific historical circumstances that gave each community its own particular version of lunar anxiety. The medieval fear of the full moon wasn't a simple superstition that can be easily dismissed or explained away. It was a complex cultural phenomenon that made sense within the broader medieval worldview and served important psychological and social functions for communities trying to understand and control a dangerous and unpredictable world. These fears provided explanatory frameworks for understanding mental illness, unpredictable behavior, and supernatural experiences. They offered practical guidance for timing medical treatments, agricultural activities, and commercial transactions. They created shared cultural narratives that bound communities together through common beliefs and rituals. And they provided regular cycles of anxiety and relief that may have helped medieval people psychologically process the many genuine dangers and uncertainties of their daily lives. The transmission mechanisms that spread and reinforced these beliefs created one of medieval Europe's most successful and persistent cultural innovations, a comprehensive system for understanding and responding to celestial influence that shaped behavior, institutions, and social organization across multiple centuries and geographic regions. The psychological weight of living under these constant lunar anxieties created what we might call a medieval version of collective trauma. Imagine waking up each morning and checking the sky, not for weather, but to calculate how many days remained until the next full moon. Imagine planning your entire month around avoiding certain activities when the moon reached its peak. This wasn't occasional worry. This was systematic life management based on celestial terror. Medieval people developed elaborate coping mechanisms to deal with these recurring fears. Households would stockpile blessed objects like holy water, religious medals, and consecrated salt specifically for full moon periods. These weren't decorative items. They were practical tools for supernatural self-defense. Families would gather these protective materials weeks in advance, treating full moon preparation with the same seriousness we might reserve for preparing for a hurricane. The economic impact of these preparations was substantial. Blacksmiths reported increased demand for iron objects during the weeks leading up to full moons, since iron was believed to repel supernatural creatures. Apothecaries sold more garlic, wolfsbane, and other protective herbs. Churches saw dramatic increases in donations for blessed candles and holy oils. The full moon generated its own medieval economy of fear, but the most fascinating aspect of medieval lunar anxiety was how it created temporary social hierarchies based on supposed supernatural knowledge. During full moon periods, people who claimed expertise in protective magic or lunar interpretation suddenly found themselves in positions of community leadership. The village wise woman who knew protective charms, the former crusader who had witnessed lunar omens in the Holy Land, the travelling merchant who had survived werewolf encounters. These individuals became temporary authorities whose advice could mean the difference between safety and supernatural disaster. This created a complex social dynamic where normal medieval hierarchies of nobility, clergy, and peasantry were temporarily supplemented by informal hierarchies of supernatural expertise. A peasant woman who knew the right protective rituals might find herself advising nobles about lunar safety. A merchant's stories about lunar encounters in distant lands could give him more influence than local religious authorities. The full moon democratized expertise in ways that the normal medieval social order actively discouraged. Medieval children grew up in this atmosphere of cyclical lunar dread, and the psychological effects shaped their entire understanding of how the world worked. Children's games often incorporated lunar themes, but these weren't playful fantasies. They were serious rehearsals for adult survival. Kids would practice hiding from imaginary werewolves, recite protective prayers against lunar madness, and learn to identify the warning signs of supernatural activity. Medieval educational practices, limited though they were, included what we might call lunar safety training. Children learned to recognize different phases of the moon and their associated dangers. They memorized protective prayers specific to lunar threats. They practiced the proper procedures for securing homes during full moon nights. This wasn't superstition education. It was practical life skills training for medieval survival. The seasonal variations in lunar fear created additional layers of complexity that modern people often miss. Summer full moons, when nights were shorter and warmer, generated different anxieties than winter full moons, when darkness lasted longer and travel was more dangerous. Spring full moons coincided with agricultural activities and concerns about crop protection. Autumn full moons occurred during harvest time, when communities were processing and storing food that needed to last through winter. Each seasonal variation brought its own specific fears and protective practices. Summer lunar rituals focused on protecting livestock that grazed at night and travelers who might be caught on the roads. Winter ceremonies emphasized home protection and prevention of lunar-induced madness during the long dark months. Spring observances concentrated on agricultural protection and fertility concerns. Autumn practices dealt with food preservation and preparation for winter isolation. These seasonal patterns created a complex annual cycle where lunar fears waxed and waned not just with monthly moon phases, but with the broader rhythms of medieval agricultural life. A summer full moon might be feared primarily for its effect on travelers and herders, while a winter full moon generated anxiety about household madness and supernatural invasion. Medieval people didn't experience generic lunar fear. They experienced specific, seasonally appropriate versions of celestial anxiety. The gender dimensions of medieval lunar fear were particularly complex and reveal fascinating aspects of medieval social organization. While both men and women feared the full moon, they often focused on different types of dangers and employed different protective strategies. Men were more likely to worry about external threats like werewolf attacks, demonic encounters, or lunar effects on warfare and travel. Women were more concerned with domestic dangers, like protecting children from lunar madness. preventing food spoilage, and managing household supernatural defenses. These gendered patterns of lunar fear reflected broader medieval assumptions about male and female spheres of responsibility, but they also created opportunities for women to exercise specialized knowledge and authority. Women were often considered more skilled at recognizing the subtle signs of lunar influence, particularly in children and domestic animals. They developed complex systems of protective domestic magic that gave them significant authority within their households during lunar danger periods. Medieval medical texts reveal that women were simultaneously seen as more vulnerable to lunar influence and more skilled at managing its effects. The connection between menstrual cycles and lunar phases made women seem naturally attuned to celestial rhythms, but this same connection made them appear more susceptible to lunar-induced madness or supernatural transformation. This created a paradoxical situation where women were both feared and valued for their supposed lunar sensitivity. Pregnancy and childbirth added another dimension to gendered lunar fears. Medieval people believed that children conceived during full moons might be born with supernatural abilities or curses. Pregnant women were advised to avoid looking directly at the full moon to prevent their unborn children from developing lycanthropic tendencies. Childbirth during full moons was considered especially dangerous, potentially resulting in difficult labor or children born with the ability to see supernatural creatures. These reproductive concerns created elaborate systems of lunar pregnancy management that governed intimate aspects of medieval family life. Couples might plan conception to avoid full moon periods. Pregnant women followed complex dietary and behavioral restrictions during lunar phases, and childbirth attendants developed specialized procedures for full moon deliveries. The moon didn't just threaten individuals, it potentially affected entire family lineages through its influence on reproduction and heredity. Medieval marriage customs also incorporated lunar fears in ways that shaped fundamental social institutions. Wedding ceremonies were carefully timed to avoid full moons, which were believed to curse marriages with madness, infidelity, or supernatural interference. The honeymoon period, originally a literal month-long observation of lunar cycles, was partly designed to help new couples navigate their first full moon together safely. Wedding planning became an exercise in astronomical calculation, with families consulting lunar calendars months in advance to ensure their celebrations avoided dangerous celestial conditions. This created additional economic pressures, as popular wedding seasons might be determined more by lunar safety than by agricultural schedules or religious holidays. Some families delayed marriages for months rather than risk full moon ceremonies, while others paid premium prices for protective ceremonies during lunar danger periods. The legal implications of medieval lunar beliefs extended far beyond individual superstitions into the fundamental structures of medieval justice. Court systems throughout Europe developed formal procedures for handling crimes committed during full moons, recognizing that lunar influence might affect both criminal behavior and the reliability of testimony. Defendants could argue for reduced sentences by claiming lunar madness, while prosecutors might seek harsher penalties for crimes that took advantage of lunar supernatural activity. Medieval legal scholars debated whether contracts signed during full moons were legally binding, given beliefs about lunar effects on mental capacity and judgment. Some jurisdictions developed formal waiting periods for important legal transactions, requiring multiple lunar cycles to pass before agreements could be finalized. This created significant complications for medieval commerce and governance, as legal systems struggled to balance practical necessity with supernatural concerns. Witness testimony presented particular challenges in lunar-related legal cases. If someone claimed to have witnessed a werewolf attack or demonic manifestation during a full moon, how should courts evaluate such testimony? Medieval legal authorities developed complex procedures for assessing supernatural claims, often requiring multiple witnesses and physical evidence. These procedures reveal how seriously legal systems took lunar-related supernatural activities, treating them not as delusions, but as potentially real events, requiring careful judicial investigation. The military implications of medieval lunar fears significantly affected warfare and defense strategies throughout Europe. Military commanders learned to plan campaigns around lunar cycles, avoiding major battles during full moons when enemy forces might include supernatural allies, or when their own troops might be affected by lunar madness. Siege warfare became particularly complicated as defenders worried about lunar effects on their ability to maintain watch schedules and respond to attacks. Medieval military manuals included detailed sections on lunar warfare tactics, describing how to protect troops from supernatural attacks and how to take advantage of enemy lunar vulnerabilities. These weren't theoretical exercises, they were practical military planning based on widespread beliefs about celestial influence on combat effectiveness. Armies carried specialized equipment for lunar warfare, including blessed weapons, protective amulets, and supplies for conducting protective rituals. Castle design incorporated features specifically intended to provide protection during full moon attacks. Many medieval fortifications included specially consecrated chambers where defenders could retreat during lunar supernatural emergencies. These rooms were equipped with religious artifacts, protective symbols, and supplies for conducting extended defensive rituals. The architecture of medieval defense was shaped not just by human military threats, but by supernatural dangers associated with lunar cycles. Naval warfare presented unique lunar challenges, as ships at sea were considered especially vulnerable to supernatural attack during full moons. Medieval naval commanders developed elaborate protocols for lunar sailing, including protective rituals, crew rotation schedules designed to prevent lunar madness, and emergency procedures for supernatural encounters. Port cities often refused to allow ships to depart during full moon periods, creating significant disruptions to maritime trade and communication. The diplomatic implications of lunar beliefs affected international relations throughout medieval Europe. Treaty negotiations might be delayed to avoid full moon periods, when negotiators feared their judgment might be compromised by lunar influence. Royal marriages, which were essentially international diplomatic agreements, required careful lunar timing to ensure the supernatural success of political alliances. Medieval diplomatic correspondence reveals constant attention to lunar cycles in international relations. Ambassadors reported on lunar conditions in foreign courts, noting how celestial events affected local political situations. Some treaties included specific provisions about lunar timing for their implementation, recognizing that supernatural conditions might affect the success of international agreements. The development of medieval universities created new institutional frameworks for understanding and managing lunar fears. Academic medical faculties developed increasingly sophisticated theories about lunar influence on human health, creating detailed systems for timing medical education according to celestial cycles. Students learned to perform dissections, surgical procedures, and pharmaceutical preparations according to lunar calendars that governed the effectiveness of medical interventions. University libraries accumulated extensive collections of lunar manuscripts, including astronomical calculations, astrological interpretations, and medical treatises that codified centuries of lunar knowledge. These academic institutions transformed popular lunar fears into scholarly disciplines, creating formal bodies of knowledge that gave intellectual respectability to celestial anxieties. The rise of medieval scholasticism brought new philosophical frameworks to lunar fears, as academic theologians worked to reconcile classical astronomical knowledge with Christian theology. University-trained clergy developed sophisticated theories about how God used celestial events to communicate with humanity, creating theological justifications for lunar fears that combined scriptural authority with Aristotelian natural philosophy. Medieval banking and commercial practices adapted to lunar beliefs in ways that significantly affected economic development. Italian banking houses developed lunar accounting systems that tracked the celestial conditions under which various transactions occurred, believing that lunar timing affected the long-term success of financial agreements. Merchant guilds incorporated lunar calendars into their trading schedules, avoiding major commercial ventures during full moon periods. The Hanseatic League which dominated northern European trade, developed standardized lunar trading practices that coordinated commercial activities across multiple cities and regions. These practices created predictable economic cycles based on celestial events, as entire trading networks would slow down or accelerate according to lunar phases. The economic integration of medieval Europe was partly shaped by shared beliefs about lunar influence on commercial success. Medieval coinage sometimes incorporated lunar symbols and timing into its production, as mints believed that coins struck during favorable lunar conditions would be more stable in value and less likely to be counterfeited. The physical money that drove medieval commerce carried embedded assumptions about celestial influence on economic value. The technological developments of the later medieval period created new opportunities for lunar observation and fear management. The invention of mechanical clocks allowed for more precise tracking of lunar cycles, while improvements in metalworking enabled the production of more sophisticated protective amulets and religious artifacts. These technological advances didn't eliminate lunar fears. They made them more precise and systematic. Medieval engineers developed ingenious mechanisms for tracking lunar phases and predicting eclipses, creating elaborate astronomical instruments that served both scientific and protective purposes. These devices allowed communities to prepare more effectively for dangerous lunar periods, while also providing the precise timing needed for protective rituals and defensive preparations. The development of printing technology in the later medieval period revolutionized the transmission of lunar knowledge, allowing for mass production of lunar calendars, protective prayer books, and astronomical guides. This technological innovation democratized access to lunar information, while also standardizing beliefs that had previously varied significantly between regions and communities. Medieval agricultural innovations were often motivated by desires to reduce vulnerability to lunar influence. Farmers developed new techniques for protecting crops from supernatural damage, including specialized planting patterns, protective crop rotations, and elaborate scarecrow designs intended to ward off supernatural rather than natural threats. The agricultural revolution that transformed medieval Europe was partly driven by efforts to achieve greater independence from celestial influences. The architectural developments of the medieval period reflected growing sophistication in managing lunar fears. Cathedral builders incorporated astronomical alignments that were believed to provide protection against supernatural threats, while castle designers developed increasingly elaborate defensive features for lunar emergencies. Medieval architecture wasn't just functional or aesthetic, it was supernatural defense technology embedded in stone and timber. The social welfare systems that emerged in later medieval Europe often included provisions for managing lunar-related community emergencies. Towns developed formal procedures for caring for citizens affected by lunar madness, protecting vulnerable populations during supernatural danger periods, and coordinating community-wide defensive measures. These systems reveal how lunar fears shaped the development of medieval social institutions and collective responsibility. Medieval hospitals and charitable institutions developed specialized facilities and procedures for treating lunar-related ailments. These weren't just medical facilities. They were community resources for managing the social disruption caused by widespread beliefs about celestial influence on human behavior. The institutional response to lunar fears created new forms of medieval social organization that bridged medical, religious, and civic authority. The international pilgrimage networks that connected medieval Europe created unprecedented opportunities for sharing and comparing lunar beliefs across vast geographic distances. Pilgrims returning from Jerusalem, Santiago, or Rome brought stories about how lunar fears were managed in distant lands, contributing to the gradual standardization of European lunar beliefs, while also introducing new variations and complications. These pilgrimage networks also created new categories of lunar expertise, as travelers who had survived multiple dangerous lunar periods in foreign territories gained reputations for supernatural knowledge and protective skills. The medieval pilgrimage system was partly a network for transmitting and validating lunar fears across the boundaries of kingdoms, languages, and local traditions. The crusading movement introduced European lunar beliefs to Middle Eastern and North African contexts, while also exposing crusaders to Islamic and Byzantine astronomical knowledge that complicated existing lunar fears. Returning crusaders brought new stories about lunar warfare, supernatural encounters, and protective techniques that had been tested in the ultimate medieval adventure of holy war in distant lands. Medieval artistic and literary traditions reflected and reinforced lunar fears through increasingly sophisticated cultural productions. Illuminated manuscripts featured elaborate lunar imagery that combined astronomical accuracy with supernatural symbolism, creating visual languages for expressing celestial anxieties. Cathedral sculptures and stained glass windows incorporated lunar themes that educated illiterate populations about celestial dangers, while also providing focal points for protective prayers and rituals. The development of vernacular literature allowed lunar fears to be expressed in local languages and cultural contexts, creating regional traditions of lunar storytelling that preserved community-specific beliefs while also participating in broader European patterns of celestial anxiety. Medieval romance literature, mystery plays, and popular ballads all incorporated lunar themes that entertained audiences while also reinforcing beliefs about supernatural dangers. The musical traditions of medieval Europe included elaborate lunar liturgies, protective chants, and seasonal songs that coordinated community responses to celestial events. These musical practices created shared emotional experiences that bound communities together through common fears, while also providing practical techniques for managing lunar anxiety through collective ritual performance. The medicinal plant cultivation that supported medieval healthcare was often timed according to lunar cycles, as herbalists believed that celestial conditions affected the potency and safety of therapeutic preparations. Medieval monastery gardens and secular herb plots were designed not just for optimal plant growth, but for lunar timing that would maximize the supernatural effectiveness of medicinal preparations. This botanical approach to lunar management created extensive networks of plant knowledge that connected medical practitioners, religious communities, and ordinary households through shared beliefs about celestial influence on natural healing processes. The medieval pharmacological system was partly a lunar timing system that coordinated therapeutic interventions with supernatural cycles. The textile industries that clothed medieval Europe incorporated lunar beliefs into production schedules, as weavers believed that fabrics created during certain lunar phases would be more durable, protective, or spiritually significant. Medieval clothing wasn't just functional or decorative. It potentially carried embedded supernatural properties that were determined by the celestial conditions under which it was manufactured. The gradual transformation of medieval lunar fears during the later medieval period reveals how cultural beliefs adapt to changing social, technological, and intellectual conditions. As universities expanded, printing developed, and international trade increased, lunar fears became more standardized but also more complex, incorporating new forms of knowledge while maintaining their fundamental emotional and social functions. By the end of the medieval period, lunar fears had evolved into sophisticated cultural systems that combined popular beliefs with learned theories, local traditions with international knowledge, and practical concerns with supernatural anxieties. These beliefs were no longer simple superstitions. They had become integrated aspects of medieval civilization that shaped institutions, technologies, and social relationships across all levels of European society. The persistence and evolution of medieval lunar fears demonstrates how cultural beliefs can maintain their essential functions while adapting their specific forms to changing historical circumstances. The medieval fear of the full moon wasn't a static superstition that eventually disappeared with better education. It was a dynamic cultural system that evolved continuously throughout the medieval period, while maintaining its core role in helping communities understand and respond to the uncertainties and dangers of medieval life. Understanding medieval lunar fears requires recognizing them as rational responses to genuine uncertainties rather than primitive mistakes that were eventually corrected by scientific progress. These beliefs served important psychological, social, and practical functions that made sense within medieval conditions, and their persistence reflects their effectiveness in meeting real human needs for explanation, prediction, and community coordination in the face of unpredictable and often dangerous circumstances. The medieval relationship with the full moon reveals fundamental aspects of how human communities create meaning, manage collective anxiety, and organize social responses to environmental challenges. While the specific content of medieval lunar beliefs may seem foreign to modern audiences, the underlying human needs they addressed remain relevant to understanding how cultures develop and maintain belief systems that help communities navigate uncertain and potentially dangerous worlds. The medieval relationship between economic life and lunar cycles created one of history's most fascinating examples of supernatural commerce. Think about it. In a world where most people lived hand to mouth, where a single bad harvest could mean starvation, and where trade routes stretched across dangerous wilderness, the idea that celestial forces could affect your livelihood wasn't just scary, it was existentially terrifying. Medieval merchants developed what can only be described as lunar business practices. Italian banking records from the 14th century show that major financial houses actually tracked lunar phases when making lending decisions. They believed that loans negotiated under a full moon were more likely to default, while contracts signed during a new moon had better chances of success. This wasn't casual superstition. This was systematic risk assessment based on celestial conditions. The Medici Bank, one of the most powerful financial institutions in medieval Europe, employed astrologers specifically to advise on lunar timing for major transactions. When you're lending thousands of florins to kings and merchants across Europe, you don't take chances with supernatural influences that might affect repayment. These weren't primitive people making random decisions. They were sophisticated financiers using every available tool to manage risk in an unpredictable world. But the economic impact went far deeper than just banking. Entire markets would shut down during full moon periods in some regions. The great cloth fairs of Champagne, which were among the largest commercial gatherings in medieval Europe, developed elaborate scheduling systems to avoid full moon dates. Thousands of merchants, representing trade networks that stretched from England to Constantinople, would coordinate their activities around lunar calendars. This created ripple effects throughout the medieval economy. If major fairs avoided full moon periods, then the transportation networks that supplied those fairs had to adjust their schedules accordingly. Shipping companies, wagon trains, and pack animal caravans all had to incorporate lunar timing into their logistics. A medieval merchant planning to transport wool from England to Italy didn't just worry about bandits, weather, and tolls. He had to calculate lunar phases to ensure his goods arrived at markets that would actually be open for business. The guild system that dominated medieval manufacturing was deeply influenced by lunar beliefs. Blacksmiths' guilds developed elaborate rules about when iron could be worked during different moon phases. They believed that metal forged during a full moon would be brittle and prone to cracking, while tools made during a new moon would be stronger and more durable. These weren't arbitrary traditions. Guildmasters had centuries of accumulated experience, and if they said lunar timing affected metal quality, apprentices listened. This created a monthly rhythm to medieval manufacturing that modern people can barely imagine. Entire industries would slow down or accelerate based on lunar phases. Brewers believed that beer started during a full moon would spoil quickly, so they timed their production cycles around lunar calendars. Textile workers thought that cloth woven under certain moon phases would be stronger and more colour-fast. Even pottery makers believed that clay fired during specific lunar conditions would be less likely to crack. The result was an economy that pulsed with celestial rhythms. Production schedules, shipping timetables, market dates, and financial transactions all moved to the beat of lunar cycles. This wasn't inefficiency or irrationality. Within the medieval worldview, it was sophisticated planning that took into account all the forces that might affect business success. Agricultural economics were even more dramatically affected by lunar beliefs. Medieval farmers didn't just plant and harvest according to seasons. They coordinated their entire agricultural year around detailed lunar calendars that specified the best moon phases for every farming activity. Planting during the wrong lunar phase wasn't just bad luck, it was economic suicide. Consider what this meant for a medieval peasant family. Their survival depended entirely on successful crop production, and they believed that lunar timing could determine whether their harvest would feed them through the winter or leave them starving. Every agricultural decision, from when to plough fields to when to store grain, was made with careful attention to lunar conditions. This created enormous psychological pressure during the weeks leading up to critical agricultural deadlines. Medieval agricultural manuals, like the 13th century work Ruralia Commoda by Petrus de Crescentius, included detailed lunar planting calendars alongside practical farming advice. These weren't folk remedies passed down through oral tradition. They were scholarly works that combined classical agricultural knowledge with contemporary astronomical observations. University-trained agricultural advisors consulted these texts when helping major landowners plan their farming operations. The economic pressure created by lunar agricultural timing led to the development of specialized lunar calendar industries. Monasteries and universities produced detailed astronomical tables that predicted lunar phases months or years in advance. These calendars were valuable commodities that rural communities would purchase to guide their agricultural planning. The business of predicting lunar phases became a significant economic sector in its own right. Weather prediction added another layer of complexity to medieval lunar economics. Medieval people believed that lunar phases influenced weather patterns, and farmers tried to time their activities not just for optimal lunar conditions, but for the weather they expected those lunar conditions to produce. A full moon in spring might be avoided for planting because it was believed to bring late frosts that could kill young crops. This weather-lunar connection created elaborate systems of agricultural forecasting that combined astronomical calculation with meteorological observation. Medieval farmers became skilled at reading multiple celestial and atmospheric signs simultaneously, trying to find the perfect window when lunar, seasonal, and weather conditions would all align favorably for their crops. Livestock management was equally affected by lunar beliefs. Medieval farmers thought that animals bred during full moons would produce offspring with supernatural tendencies or physical abnormalities. Cattle, sheep, and pigs were carefully managed to avoid mating during dangerous lunar periods. This created complex breeding schedules that had to balance biological cycles with celestial timing. The dairy industry developed particularly elaborate lunar practices. Medieval people believed that milk from cows milked during a full moon would spoil more quickly and might carry supernatural contamination. Cheesemakers thought that products made during certain lunar phases would age better and have superior flavor. These beliefs created monthly variations in dairy production that affected both local consumption and long-distance trade. Medieval animal husbandry manuals included detailed instructions for lunar timing of breeding, feeding, and medical treatment of livestock. The Livre du Roi Modus, a 14th century hunting and animal management text, devoted entire chapters to coordinating animal care with lunar cycles. These practices weren't casual folk beliefs. They were professional standards that determined the economic success or failure of agricultural enterprises. The transportation industry that connected medieval Europe was profoundly shaped by lunar fears. Medieval roads were dangerous enough during daylight hours, with bandits, wild animals, and difficult terrain posing constant threats. But travelling during a full moon added supernatural dangers that many people simply refused to risk. This created a monthly transportation cycle, where road travel would dramatically decrease during full moon periods. Merchant caravans would time their journeys to avoid full moon dates, even if this meant significant delays or additional costs. Innkeepers and stable masters learned to expect reduced business during certain lunar phases, while also preparing for increased demand during safer periods. The economic impact was substantial. If major trade routes experienced reduced traffic during full moons, this affected not just the merchants and transporters, but all the businesses that served them. Inns, stables, food suppliers, equipment merchants, and money changers all had to adjust their operations to accommodate lunar transportation patterns. Maritime trade faced even greater lunar challenges. Medieval sailors believed that full moons made sea voyages more dangerous by increasing supernatural activity and affecting weather patterns. Ship captains would delay departures or seek shelter in port during full moon periods, creating monthly bottlenecks in maritime commerce. Port cities developed elaborate systems for managing lunar shipping delays. Warehouses had to accommodate goods that couldn't be shipped during full moon periods. Harbour masters coordinated with multiple shipping companies to ensure that lunar delays didn't create complete commercial paralysis. The entire Mediterranean and North Sea trading networks had to function around monthly periods when maritime activity was significantly reduced. Naval warfare added military dimensions to maritime lunar concerns. Medieval naval commanders believed that battles fought during full moons were more likely to involve supernatural intervention. This created strategic complications where military necessity might conflict with lunar timing, forcing commanders to choose between tactical advantage and supernatural safety. The fishing industry developed some of the most sophisticated lunar practices in medieval Europe. Fishermen believed that different lunar phases affected both fish behavior and the safety of fishing operations. They thought that fish caught during full moons might be contaminated with supernatural influences, while certain lunar phases produced better catches but required additional protective measures. Medieval fishing communities developed detailed lunar fishing calendars that specified when different types of fish could be safely caught and consumed. These calendars were passed down through generations of fishing families and became essential tools for managing both economic success and supernatural safety in maritime communities. The preservation and storage of food became critical issues during lunar periods when fresh supplies might be unavailable due to transportation delays or safety concerns. Medieval communities developed elaborate systems for stockpiling food before full moon periods, when normal supply chains might be disrupted by lunar fears. This created monthly cycles of food hoarding and consumption that affected prices, availability, and nutrition throughout medieval Europe. Markets would see increased demand for preserved foods as full moons approached, followed by periods of abundance when transportation and trade resumed during safer lunar phases. Medieval food preservation techniques were often timed according to lunar phases. Salt curing, smoking, and fermentation were believed to work better during certain lunar conditions. This meant that food preservation activities had to be carefully coordinated with both the availability of raw materials and the optimal lunar timing for preservation techniques. The brewing and winemaking industries developed particularly complex relationships with lunar cycles. Medieval brewers believed that fermentation processes were directly influenced by lunar phases, and they timed their production to take advantage of favorable celestial conditions. Monastic breweries, which produced much of medieval Europe's beer, incorporated lunar timing into their religious and economic activities. Wine production faced similar lunar constraints, with vintners believing that grapes harvested during certain lunar phases would produce better wine while avoiding supernatural contamination. The timing of harvest, fermentation, and aging were all coordinated with lunar calendars that winemakers believed were essential for producing high-quality products. The medicinal plant industry that supplied medieval healthcare was entirely structured around lunar timing. Herbalists believed that the potency and safety of medicinal plants depended on when they were collected, and elaborate lunar harvesting calendars governed the entire supply chain for medieval medicine. Monastic herb gardens, which were major suppliers of medicinal plants, coordinated their harvesting and processing activities around detailed lunar calendars. The economic value of medicinal herbs was believed to fluctuate dramatically based on lunar timing, creating markets where the same plant might be worthless or precious, depending on celestial conditions at the time of harvest. Medieval physicians prescribed treatments that required specific lunar timing, creating demand cycles for medicinal supplies that had to be coordinated months in advance. Apothecaries stockpiled certain herbs during favorable lunar periods to ensure availability during times when fresh collection was considered dangerous or ineffective. The textile industry developed elaborate systems for lunar timing of production processes. Medieval weavers believed that cloth produced during certain lunar phases would be stronger, more colour-fast, and less susceptible to supernatural influences. This created monthly production cycles that affected everything from raw material processing to finished product distribution. Wool processing, linen production, and silk weaving all incorporated lunar timing into their manufacturing schedules. Guild regulations specified optimal lunar conditions for different textile processes, and master craftsmen planned their production calendars around astronomical predictions that might be made months in advance. The dyeing of textiles was particularly affected by lunar beliefs. Medieval dyers thought that colours applied during certain lunar phases would be more vibrant and permanent, while dyes applied during full moons might fade quickly or produce unexpected colour changes. This created complex scheduling challenges for textile producers who had to coordinate raw material availability with optimal lunar timing. Medieval mining operations were profoundly influenced by beliefs about lunar effects on underground activities. Miners believed that digging during full moons was more dangerous because supernatural creatures were more active in underground spaces. This created monthly cycles where mining production would decrease during certain lunar phases. The extraction of metals, salt, and stone all incorporated lunar timing into operational planning. Mine owners had to balance economic pressure for continuous production with worker safety concerns about supernatural underground dangers during full moon periods. This created complex labour management challenges that affected both productivity and worker relations. Medieval metallurgy incorporated lunar timing into smelting and refining processes. Metalworkers believed that ores processed during certain lunar phases would yield purer metals with better working properties. This created scheduling constraints that affected both the cost and quality of metal products throughout medieval Europe. The construction industry adapted to lunar beliefs through elaborate project planning that coordinated building activities with celestial timing. Medieval builders thought that foundations laid during full moons might be unstable, while structures completed during certain lunar phases would be more durable and less susceptible to supernatural influences. Cathedral construction projects, which often took decades to complete, incorporated lunar timing into their long-term planning. Master builders consulted astronomical tables when scheduling critical construction phases, believing that celestial timing affected both structural integrity and spiritual significance of religious buildings. Castle construction faced additional challenges because defensive structures needed to provide protection against both military and supernatural threats. Medieval military engineers incorporated lunar timing into fortification planning, ensuring that defensive features would be effective during the full moon periods when supernatural attacks were considered most likely. Urban planning in medieval cities reflected lunar concerns through the design of market squares, defensive walls, and public buildings. City planners tried to create urban spaces that would function effectively during lunar periods when normal activities might be disrupted by supernatural fears or transportation delays. The leather and fur trades developed sophisticated systems for lunar timing of animal processing and hide preparation. Medieval leatherworkers believed that hides processed during certain lunar phases would be more durable and less likely to spoil. This created monthly cycles in leather production that affected everything from shoemaking to bookbinding. Fur trappers and hunters coordinated their activities around lunar calendars that specified optimal timing for different types of hunting. They believed that animals caught during certain lunar phases would have better fur quality while avoiding supernatural contamination that might affect the value of their pelts. Medieval parchment and paper production incorporated lunar timing into manufacturing processes. Scribes and book producers believed that writing materials made during certain lunar phases would be more durable and less susceptible to fading or deterioration. This affected the entire book production industry throughout medieval Europe. The salt industry, which was crucial for food preservation and trade, developed elaborate lunar timing systems for salt extraction and processing. Salt producers believed that lunar phases affected both the quality and quantity of salt that could be extracted from seawater or salt mines. Medieval salt merchants coordinated their trading activities around lunar calendars, believing that salt sold during certain lunar phases would have better preservation properties and longer storage life. This created monthly price fluctuations in salt markets that affected food preservation throughout Europe. The spice trade that connected medieval Europe with Asian markets incorporated lunar timing into long-distance commercial planning. Spice merchants believed that certain lunar phases were more favorable for long sea voyages, while spices purchased during specific lunar conditions would maintain their potency during extended transportation and storage. Medieval banking houses that financed international spice trading developed sophisticated systems for coordinating lunar timing across multiple markets and transportation networks. The economic complexity of managing lunar timing across intercontinental trade routes required unprecedented levels of commercial coordination and astronomical calculation. The development of medieval insurance practices was partly driven by needs to manage risks associated with lunar timing. Merchants and financiers developed early forms of insurance that took into account supernatural risks associated with lunar phases, creating contractual systems that allocated responsibility for losses caused by lunar-related disruptions. Medieval guilds developed elaborate dispute resolution systems for handling conflicts related to lunar timing. When production schedules, delivery dates, or quality standards were affected by lunar considerations, guild courts had to determine fair compensation and responsibility among different parties in complex commercial relationships. The international trade fairs that connected medieval European markets with Asian and African commerce incorporated lunar timing into their scheduling and operational procedures. Fair organizers had to coordinate lunar calendars across different cultural and religious systems, creating unprecedented challenges in international commercial cooperation. Medieval currency exchange developed systems for managing fluctuations in money values that were believed to be influenced by lunar phases. Money changers thought that exchange rates established during certain lunar conditions would be more stable, creating complex financial instruments that incorporated astronomical predictions. The credit systems that financed medieval commerce incorporated lunar timing into lending practices and repayment schedules. Medieval bankers believed that debts incurred during certain lunar phases were more likely to be repaid successfully, while loans made during full moons carried higher risks of default. Medieval accounting practices developed systems for tracking the lunar conditions under which different transactions occurred. Commercial records included astronomical notations alongside financial data, creating business archives that combined economic information with celestial observations. The legal frameworks that governed medieval commerce had to accommodate disputes related to lunar timing. Commercial law developed precedents for handling conflicts where lunar considerations affected contract performance, creating legal principles that balanced supernatural beliefs with practical business necessity. Medieval trade routes were planned not just around geographic and political considerations, but also around lunar timing that affected both transportation safety and market demand. The great commercial highways that connected medieval Europe with Asia and Africa incorporated astronomical calculations into their operational planning. The development of medieval capitalism was significantly influenced by lunar beliefs that affected risk assessment, investment timing, and market coordination. Early capitalist enterprises had to function within cultural systems that treated celestial timing as a fundamental business consideration. Medieval entrepreneurship required sophisticated understanding of lunar timing alongside traditional business skills. Successful medieval merchants needed to combine financial acumen with astronomical knowledge, creating a unique form of cosmic capitalism that integrated supernatural beliefs with economic rationality. The evolution of medieval monetary systems was affected by beliefs about lunar influence on metal quality and currency stability. Coin production incorporated lunar timing into minting processes, while monetary policy had to account for periodic disruptions caused by lunar fears. International diplomacy in medieval Europe often required coordination of lunar timing across different kingdoms and cultural systems. Trade agreements and commercial treaties incorporated astronomical considerations that affected both economic relationships and political alliances. The technological innovations that transformed late medieval commerce were partly driven by needs to better manage lunar timing and its economic effects. Improved astronomical instruments, better calendar systems, and more sophisticated accounting methods all served to make lunar commercial practices more precise and reliable. Medieval urban development was shaped by the need to accommodate economic activities that fluctuated according to lunar cycles. City planning incorporated market scheduling, transportation coordination, and commercial district design that could function effectively despite monthly disruptions caused by lunar fears. The social mobility that characterized later medieval Europe was partly enabled by opportunities created by lunar commercial practices. Individuals who developed expertise in astronomical timing for business purposes could achieve economic success and social advancement that might otherwise be unavailable. Medieval financial innovation was driven partly by the challenge of managing complex commercial relationships that incorporated lunar timing. New forms of contracts, partnership agreements, and risk-sharing arrangements were developed to handle the unique challenges of cosmic commerce. The emergence of professional classes in medieval Europe included specialists in astronomical timing for commercial purposes. These professionals served as advisors to merchants, manufacturers, and financiers, creating new forms of expertise that combined scientific knowledge with business application. Medieval economic theory began to incorporate systematic analysis of how supernatural beliefs affected market behavior and commercial decision-making. Scholarly treatises on commerce included discussions of optimal lunar timing alongside more conventional economic considerations. The international scope of medieval commerce required unprecedented coordination of lunar beliefs across different cultural and religious systems. Medieval merchants had to navigate not just different currencies and legal systems, but also different astronomical traditions and lunar timing practices. The complexity of managing lunar timing across multiple economic sectors created opportunities for specialization and professional development. Medieval Europe saw the emergence of astronomical consultants, lunar calendar producers, and commercial timing advisors who served the growing needs of cosmic commerce. The gradual transformation of medieval lunar commercial practices reveals how economic systems adapt to changing cultural beliefs while maintaining their fundamental functions. As scientific understanding advanced and international trade expanded, lunar timing became more sophisticated, but remained economically significant throughout the medieval period. The legacy of medieval lunar commerce can be seen in the development of modern business practices that still acknowledge the psychological and social effects of timing on commercial success. While we no longer fear supernatural lunar influences, the medieval recognition that timing affects business outcomes remains relevant to contemporary economic analysis. The medieval integration of astronomical knowledge with commercial practice created precedents for the scientific management of business that would influence economic development long after supernatural lunar fears had faded. The systematic approach to timing that characterized medieval cosmic commerce contributed to the development of more sophisticated forms of business planning and risk management. Understanding medieval lunar commerce reveals how cultural beliefs can create complex economic systems that serve practical functions even when their supernatural foundations may seem irrational to later observers. The medieval economy of lunar fear demonstrates the remarkable human capacity to create functional institutions around shared beliefs, regardless of their objective truth. The persistence of lunar timing in medieval commerce throughout centuries of social, technological, and intellectual change demonstrates how deeply embedded cultural practices can maintain their economic functions even as their underlying justifications evolve. Medieval cosmic commerce was not a temporary aberration, but a sophisticated adaptation to the challenge of managing uncertainty in a world where supernatural and natural forces were understood to work together. The fascinating thing about medieval lunar fears is how they created what we might call supernatural social services. Communities didn't just individually cower in their homes during full moons. They developed elaborate collective response systems that were, frankly, more organized than many modern emergency protocols. Take the night watch systems that emerged in medieval towns. These weren't just guards looking out for thieves or fires. During full moon periods, communities would organize special supernatural patrol units. These volunteers, usually led by someone with military experience or claimed religious authority, would walk predetermined routes through the town carrying blessed torches, holy water, and iron weapons specifically designed to combat lunar threats. The logistics were impressive. Towns would maintain detailed rosters of who was responsible for supernatural watch duty during each full moon. They'd stockpile protective materials months in advance. Special signal systems using church bells or horn blasts would alert the entire community if supernatural activity was detected. This wasn't random panic. This was coordinated disaster response based on shared beliefs about celestial dangers. But here's what's really remarkable. These community defense systems created new forms of medieval social organization that crossed traditional class boundaries. During a full moon emergency, a peasant who knew protective rituals might give orders to a noble who lacked supernatural expertise. A merchant's wife who could recognize signs of demonic activity might coordinate the response of trained soldiers who were useless against spiritual threats. Medieval towns developed what we might call lunar emergency protocols. When reports came in of unusual supernatural activity, communities would implement graduated response procedures. Level 1 might involve increased patrols and protective prayers. Level 2 could mean cancelling all non-essential outdoor activities. Level 3 might require complete lockdown until the full moon passed. These weren't theoretical procedures. Town records from across medieval Europe contain detailed accounts of communities implementing full lunar emergencies. The city of Cologne has surviving documents describing a 3-day lockdown in 1312 after multiple reports of supernatural encounters during a particularly bright full moon. Business stopped, markets closed, even essential services like water delivery were suspended until the lunar threat passed. The economic disruption was enormous, but medieval communities considered it a necessary cost of survival. What's fascinating is how they developed compensation systems for businesses and workers affected by lunar emergencies. Guilds would pool resources to support members who lost income during supernatural lockdowns. Towns would provide emergency food supplies for families who couldn't work during lunar danger periods. Medieval children grew up understanding that lunar emergencies were a normal part of life, like seasonal floods or harvest failures. Schools developed curriculum that included lunar safety training, alongside reading, writing, and religious instruction. Children learned to recognize different types of supernatural threats, memorize protective prayers, and follow emergency procedures during lunar crises. But the most sophisticated aspect of medieval lunar response was how communities developed early warning systems. Networks of monasteries, castles, and trading posts would send messages about approaching supernatural activity associated with upcoming full moons. A monastery might report unusual animal behavior or strange atmospheric phenomena that suggested the next full moon would be particularly dangerous. These warning networks operated across hundreds of miles, creating continent-wide systems for predicting and preparing for lunar emergencies. Merchants traveling between cities would carry news about supernatural conditions in distant regions. Pilgrims returning from religious sites would report on lunar-related incidents they'd witnessed or heard about during their journeys. The development of these communication networks was driven partly by the need to coordinate lunar safety measures, but they also served broader functions in medieval society. The same messengers who carried warnings about supernatural threats also transported commercial information, political news, and personal correspondence. Medieval lunar fear helped create some of Europe's first systematic communication systems. Religious institutions played complex roles in these community response systems. While church authorities sometimes tried to discourage what they saw as excessive superstition, they also recognized that lunar fears served important social functions. Organized community responses to celestial threats reinforced religious authority, encouraged collective prayer and ritual, and demonstrated the power of Christian protective practices. Many churches developed special lunar liturgies designed to protect their communities during full moon periods. These weren't official Catholic services, but local adaptations that combined Orthodox prayers with protective rituals specifically aimed at lunar dangers. Priests would lead community processions, carrying blessed objects and reciting prayers designed to ward off supernatural threats. The economic impact of these religious responses was substantial. Churches would see dramatically increased donations during full moon periods as community members sought additional spiritual protection. The sale of blessed candles, holy water, and protective amulets would spike in the weeks leading up to full moons, creating seasonal economic cycles that affected religious institutions throughout Europe. But medieval lunar response systems also created opportunities for fraud and exploitation. Individuals claiming special knowledge about supernatural threats could gain significant influence and economic advantage during lunar danger periods. Some people made their living as lunar consultants, traveling from community to community, offering protective services during full moon emergencies. These lunar entrepreneurs developed sophisticated business models around celestial fears. They would arrive in towns weeks before full moons, offering to assess supernatural vulnerability and provide protective services for fees. Some communities became dependent on these traveling experts, believing they lacked the local knowledge needed to survive lunar threats without professional assistance. The development of lunar expertise as a professional specialty created new forms of medieval social mobility. Individuals from humble backgrounds who claimed supernatural knowledge could achieve significant wealth and influence through their lunar consulting services. This created tension with traditional religious and secular authorities who saw these lunar entrepreneurs as competition for their own spiritual and temporal power. Medieval universities began developing formal academic approaches to lunar studies, partly in response to the proliferation of unofficial lunar experts. Scholarly institutions wanted to establish legitimate, learned approaches to celestial dangers that could compete with popular lunar entrepreneurs. This led to the emergence of academic astrology and astronomical medicine as respectable university subjects. The tension between popular lunar beliefs and learned academic approaches created fascinating intellectual dynamics in medieval Europe. University-trained scholars developed sophisticated theoretical frameworks for understanding lunar influence, while practical lunar experts focused on techniques that seemed to work regardless of their theoretical basis. These different approaches to lunar knowledge sometimes conflicted dramatically. Academic theories about lunar influence might contradict popular beliefs about protective practices, creating confusion and conflict within communities trying to prepare for full moon dangers. Some towns employed both university-trained astronomical advisors and traditional lunar experts, hoping to combine the best of learned and popular approaches. The legal systems that governed medieval Europe had to develop frameworks for managing disputes related to lunar expertise and protective services. When lunar consultants failed to provide effective protection, or when their advice led to economic losses, communities needed legal mechanisms for seeking compensation and resolving conflicts. Medieval courts developed precedents for evaluating claims about supernatural expertise and the effectiveness of protective measures. These legal proceedings reveal fascinating details about how lunar beliefs operated in practice and how communities balanced faith in supernatural protection with practical concerns about fraud and incompetence. The international dimensions of medieval lunar fears created diplomatic challenges when different regions had conflicting beliefs about optimal protective measures. Trade negotiations and political alliances sometimes had to accommodate different lunar timing systems and supernatural protocols that varied between kingdoms and cultural regions. Diplomatic correspondence from the medieval period contains frequent references to lunar considerations affecting international relations. Treaties might include provisions about lunar timing for their implementation, while diplomatic visits could be delayed or rescheduled to avoid full moon periods when supernatural dangers were considered heightened. The marriage alliances that connected medieval European royal families required careful coordination of lunar timing across different kingdoms and cultural traditions. Wedding ceremonies needed to satisfy multiple sets of lunar beliefs and protective requirements, creating complex negotiations that combined romantic, political, and supernatural considerations. Medieval warfare was significantly affected by the need to coordinate military campaigns with lunar safety requirements. Army commanders had to balance tactical advantages with supernatural concerns, while siege warfare required special considerations for defending or attacking during full moon periods, when supernatural activity was believed to intensify. Military manuals from the medieval period include detailed sections on lunar warfare tactics and protective measures for troops operating during dangerous celestial conditions. These weren't theoretical exercises, but practical guides based on military experience with supernatural threats encountered during actual campaigns. The logistics of medieval warfare required unprecedented coordination of lunar timing across complex military operations involving thousands of soldiers, extensive supply lines, and coordinated attacks across multiple geographic regions. Military success often depended as much on astronomical calculation as on traditional tactical planning. Naval warfare presented unique challenges because ships at sea were considered especially vulnerable to supernatural attack during full moons. Medieval naval commanders developed specialized protocols for lunar maritime operations, including protective rituals, emergency procedures for supernatural encounters, and coordination systems for fleet operations during dangerous celestial conditions. Port cities throughout medieval Europe developed sophisticated systems for managing the economic and military disruptions caused by lunar maritime restrictions. These systems had to accommodate the needs of international shipping, while also providing protection against supernatural threats that were believed to be especially dangerous in coastal areas. The fishing industries that provided much of medieval Europe's protein developed some of the most elaborate lunar management systems in medieval society. Fishing communities needed to balance economic necessity with supernatural safety, creating complex scheduling systems that optimize both catch quality and crew protection. Medieval fishing villages developed detailed lunar fishing calendars that specified optimal timing for different types of fishing, while also providing guidance for protective measures needed during dangerous celestial conditions. These calendars were essential tools for managing both economic success and supernatural safety in maritime communities. The preservation and distribution of fish caught during different lunar phases required elaborate systems for managing food safety concerns related to supernatural contamination. Medieval fish markets developed quality standards that incorporated lunar timing alongside traditional measures of freshness and preparation. Agricultural communities faced similar challenges in coordinating farming activities with lunar safety requirements. Medieval farmers needed to optimize crop production, while also avoiding agricultural activities during periods when supernatural threats were considered most dangerous. The seasonal coordination of agricultural lunar timing created complex scheduling challenges that affected entire regional economies. when optimal farming conditions conflicted with dangerous lunar phases. Rural communities had to make difficult decisions about accepting supernatural risks or sacrificing agricultural productivity. Medieval agricultural innovation was often driven by the desire to reduce vulnerability to lunar-related disruptions. Farmers developed new techniques for protecting crops and livestock from supernatural threats, while also improving their ability to work effectively during safe lunar periods. The storage and preservation of agricultural products required careful attention to lunar timing that was believed to affect food quality and safety. Medieval communities developed elaborate systems for coordinating food storage activities with optimal celestial conditions, while also maintaining adequate supplies during lunar danger periods. Rural communities developed specialized roles for individuals who could coordinate agricultural activities with lunar timing requirements. These agricultural lunar coordinators became essential figures in medieval farming communities, responsible for optimizing both productivity and supernatural safety in rural economic activities. The integration of lunar timing with seasonal agricultural cycles created sophisticated planning systems that required detailed knowledge of both astronomical patterns and farming techniques. Medieval agricultural communities developed expertise that combined practical farming skills with complex astronomical calculation. Urban communities faced different but equally complex challenges in managing lunar-related disruptions to city life. Medieval towns needed to maintain essential services, while also accommodating the economic and social disruptions caused by lunar fears and protective measures. The development of medieval urban planning incorporated considerations about managing lunar emergencies alongside traditional concerns about defense, commerce, and population management. City designers tried to create urban spaces that could function effectively during both normal conditions and lunar crisis periods. Medieval guilds developed sophisticated systems for coordinating their activities with lunar timing requirements, while also maintaining the productivity and quality standards needed for economic success. Guild regulations incorporated astronomical considerations alongside traditional craft requirements. The professional specialization that characterized medieval urban life included experts in lunar timing and supernatural protection, who served the complex needs of city-based crafts, trades, and services. These urban lunar specialists developed expertise that differed significantly from rural approaches to celestial timing. Medieval cities became centers for the development and distribution of lunar timing information, astronomical instruments, and protective materials needed by communities throughout their surrounding regions. Urban markets specialized in supplying the tools and knowledge needed for effective lunar management. The educational institutions that emerged in medieval cities incorporated lunar studies into their curricula as essential knowledge for successful participation in urban economic and social life. Students learned astronomical calculation and supernatural protection alongside traditional academic subjects. Medieval hospitals and medical institutions developed specialized facilities and procedures for treating conditions believed to be caused or exacerbated by lunar influence. These medical facilities served not just individual patients but entire communities during lunar health emergencies. The pharmaceutical industries that supplied medieval medicine required sophisticated coordination of lunar timing for both the production and administration of therapeutic treatments. Medieval apothecaries developed expertise that combined medical knowledge with detailed astronomical calculation. Mental health treatment in medieval society was heavily influenced by beliefs about lunar effects on human psychology and behavior. Medieval communities developed specialized approaches to managing individuals affected by lunar-induced madness or behavioral changes. The social welfare systems that emerged in medieval Europe included provisions for supporting community members who were temporarily or permanently affected by lunar-related conditions. These systems reveal how lunar beliefs shape the development of collective responsibility for individual welfare. Medieval legal systems had to accommodate the complex challenges created by lunar beliefs and their effects on individual behavior and community safety. Courts developed procedures for handling cases where lunar influence was considered a mitigating or aggravating factor in criminal behavior. The penal systems that managed criminal justice in medieval Europe incorporated beliefs about lunar influence on both criminal behavior and the effectiveness of punishment and rehabilitation. Medieval prisons and punishment systems included special procedures for managing inmates during lunar danger periods. Property law in medieval Europe had to accommodate disputes related to lunar timing and its effects on agricultural productivity, commercial success, and property values. Legal frameworks developed principles for allocating responsibility and compensation when lunar considerations affected property rights and economic relationships. Contract law incorporated provisions for managing the effects of lunar timing on commercial agreements and business relationships. Medieval legal systems recognized that supernatural beliefs could legitimately affect the performance and interpretation of contractual obligations. International law between medieval European kingdoms required coordination of different lunar timing systems and supernatural protection requirements. Diplomatic protocols incorporated astronomical considerations alongside traditional political and commercial negotiations. The development of medieval legal scholarship included systematic analysis of how supernatural beliefs affected legal principles and practical justice. Legal theorists worked to integrate lunar considerations into coherent frameworks for understanding law and social order. Medieval taxation systems had to accommodate the economic disruptions caused by lunar timing requirements and supernatural protection measures. Tax collectors and financial administrators developed systems for managing revenue collection that accounted for periodic disruptions caused by celestial events. The monetary systems that facilitated medieval commerce incorporated beliefs about lunar influence on currency stability and economic transactions. Medieval financial institutions developed procedures for managing the effects of astronomical timing on banking and monetary policy. International trade required unprecedented coordination of lunar timing systems across different cultural and religious traditions. Medieval merchants developed expertise in managing multiple astronomical calendars and supernatural protection requirements simultaneously. The technological innovations that transformed medieval Europe were often motivated by the desire to improve lunar timing accuracy and supernatural protection effectiveness. Astronomical instruments, calendar systems, and protective technologies all served the needs of communities managing lunar-related challenges. Medieval engineering incorporated astronomical considerations into the design of buildings, transportation systems, and infrastructure projects. Engineers developed techniques for creating structures that could function effectively during both normal conditions and lunar emergency periods. The architectural developments of the medieval period reflected growing sophistication in managing lunar-related challenges through environmental design. Buildings incorporated features intended to provide protection against supernatural threats while also accommodating the social and economic disruptions caused by lunar fears. Transportation infrastructure in medieval Europe was designed to accommodate the periodic disruptions caused by lunar timing requirements and supernatural protection measures. Road systems, bridges, and port facilities incorporated features intended to maintain essential connectivity during lunar danger periods. Communication systems in medieval Europe were partly developed to serve the needs of communities coordinating lunar timing and supernatural protection across vast geographic distances. Medieval Europe's communication networks served both practical and supernatural functions. The artistic and cultural developments of medieval Europe reflected and reinforced lunar beliefs through sophisticated symbolic systems that combined aesthetic expression with practical supernatural education. Medieval art served both decorative and protective functions in communities managing lunar-related challenges. Literary traditions in medieval Europe incorporated lunar themes that entertained audiences while also transmitting essential knowledge about supernatural protection and community safety. Medieval literature served both cultural and practical functions in societies organized around celestial timing. Musical traditions provided communities with tools for coordinating collective responses to lunar challenges, while also creating shared cultural experiences that reinforced social cohesion during stressful periods. Medieval music served both artistic and practical functions in lunar emergency management. The gradual transformation of medieval lunar beliefs reveals how cultural systems adapt to changing social, technological, and intellectual conditions, while maintaining their essential functions in helping communities manage uncertainty and coordinate collective action. The persistence of lunar timing considerations throughout the medieval period demonstrates how deeply embedded cultural practices can maintain their social and economic functions even as their supernatural justifications become increasingly questioned by learned authorities and practical experience. Medieval lunar fears created some of history's most sophisticated examples of community-based risk management, demonstrating how shared beliefs can generate effective collective responses to perceived threats regardless of their objective reality. Understanding medieval lunar beliefs requires recognizing them as rational adaptations to genuine uncertainties rather than primitive mistakes, eventually corrected by scientific progress. These beliefs served important functions that made sense within medieval conditions and remain relevant to understanding how communities develop effective responses to complex challenges. The medieval relationship with the full moon reveals fundamental aspects of how human societies create meaning, manage collective anxiety, and organize coordinated responses to environmental and social challenges that exceed individual capacity for control or understanding. The legacy of medieval lunar fears extends far beyond their specific supernatural content to demonstrate enduring principles about community organization, collective decision-making, and cultural adaptation that remain relevant to contemporary challenges requiring coordinated social responses to complex and uncertain threats. The transformation of medieval lunar fears during periods of social crisis reveals just how deeply these beliefs were woven into the fabric of European civilization. When communities faced genuine disasters like plague outbreaks, famine, or warfare, lunar anxieties didn't disappear. They intensified, creating feedback loops where real suffering seemed to confirm supernatural threats. Consider what happened during the Black Death of the 14th century. As plague swept across Europe, killing roughly 1/3 of the population, survivors desperately searched for explanations. Many chronicles from this period describe how lunar eclipses and unusual moon phases were interpreted as divine warnings about the approaching pestilence. The plague didn't cause lunar fears, but it certainly amplified them. Medieval physicians treating plague victims incorporated lunar timing into their desperate attempts at healing. They believed that bloodletting during certain moon phases might purge the disease from patients' bodies, while treatments administered during full moons could prove fatal. Surviving medical records from plague-stricken cities show doctors carefully tracking lunar cycles alongside symptoms and mortality rates, trying to find patterns that might explain why some patients survived while others perished. But here's what's particularly fascinating about plague-era lunar beliefs. As traditional medical treatments failed catastrophically, some communities began to suspect that the moon itself might be spreading disease. Italian chronicles describe towns where people refused to look directly at the full moon, believing that lunar light could carry plague infection. French records mention villages that covered their wells and water sources during full moons to prevent lunar contamination. This wasn't entirely unreasonable within medieval understanding of disease transmission. If you believed that bad air or miasma could spread illness, then it wasn't much of a leap to think that moonlight might carry similar contamination. Medieval people were making logical connections based on the best information they had available. The social disruption caused by plague created new categories of lunar expertise. As established medical authorities died or fled, communities turned to anyone who claimed knowledge about supernatural protection. Plague survivors who credited their survival to lunar timing suddenly found themselves in positions of authority, teaching protective measures to desperate communities. Some of these plague-era lunar experts developed remarkably sophisticated systems. They created detailed calendars that predicted not just moon phases, but also the specific types of supernatural activity that might accompany each lunar cycle during pestilence periods. These weren't random superstitions, they were systematic attempts to create order and predictability during social collapse. The economic disruption caused by plague also transformed how lunar beliefs operated in practice. With normal commercial and social structures destroyed, communities became more dependent on local knowledge and traditional practices. Lunar timing, which might have been supplemented by university-trained physicians or international trade networks during normal times, became the primary framework for making decisions about health, safety, and survival. Interestingly, some communities that survived plague outbreaks credited their survival to strict adherence to lunar protective measures. Whether this was coincidence or the result of behaviors that actually did provide some protection, it reinforced beliefs about lunar influence for generations. Villages that had followed traditional lunar health practices and experienced lower mortality rates became examples cited throughout Europe of the effectiveness of celestial timing. The religious response to plague also intensified lunar fears through apocalyptic interpretations of current events. Many medieval Christians believed they were witnessing the end times, and unusual lunar phenomena during plague years seemed to confirm biblical prophecies about celestial signs preceding the Last Judgment. The Book of Revelation's description of the moon turning to blood took on immediate terrifying relevance. Flagellant movements that swept across Europe during plague years often incorporated lunar timing into their penitential practices. These groups believed that extreme acts of religious devotion might appease divine wrath and end the pestilence, and they timed their processions and rituals according to lunar calendars that promised maximum spiritual effectiveness. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of plague-era lunar beliefs was how they changed the transmission of supernatural knowledge. With so many learned authorities dead, oral traditions became more important for preserving and passing on lunar expertise. Grandmothers who had survived multiple plague outbreaks became repositories of protective knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The warfare that devastated medieval Europe also created unique interactions between lunar fears and military realities. The 100 Years' War, for instance, produced numerous accounts of battles that were delayed, rescheduled, or fought differently because of lunar considerations. Military commanders had to balance tactical advantages with supernatural concerns, creating strategic complications that affected major historical events. Medieval military chronicles contain detailed accounts of how lunar timing influenced battlefield decisions. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 was fought during a waning moon, which some chroniclers credited for the English victory, claiming that French knights were more susceptible to confusion and panic during that lunar phase. Whether this had any real effect, the belief shaped how people understood and remembered major military events. Siege warfare created particularly complex interactions between lunar timing and military necessity. Attacking forces might delay assaults to avoid full moon periods when defenders were believed to have supernatural advantages. Meanwhile, defenders had to maintain vigilance during lunar danger periods, while also managing normal military threats. Some castles developed specialized defensive procedures for full moon sieges. The development of gunpowder weapons during the later medieval period created new categories of lunar military belief. Early cannoneers believed that gunpowder mixed or stored during certain lunar phases would be more powerful or reliable. Artillery units developed lunar timing protocols for ammunition preparation that combined practical chemistry with supernatural precautions. Naval warfare during medieval conflicts incorporated sophisticated lunar considerations that went far beyond simple timing of tides. Medieval naval commanders believed that sea battles fought during full moons were more likely to involve supernatural intervention, while storms and unusual weather during lunar phases could signal divine judgment on military campaigns. The logistics of medieval warfare required unprecedented coordination of lunar timing across complex military operations. Army supply trains had to account for periods when transportation might be disrupted by lunar fears, while military communication systems needed to accommodate communities that might refuse to provide assistance during supernatural danger periods. Medieval mercenary companies developed their own traditions of lunar military practice that differed from feudal armies. Professional soldiers who fought in multiple campaigns across different regions had to navigate varying local beliefs about lunar warfare, while also developing their own practical knowledge about timing military operations. The diplomatic consequences of military lunar beliefs affected peace negotiations and treaty arrangements throughout medieval Europe. Ceasefires might be timed to avoid full moon periods when renewed fighting was considered more likely, while peace treaties could include provisions about lunar timing for their implementation. International alliances required coordination of different military lunar timing systems across multiple kingdoms and cultural regions. Medieval military cooperation involved not just tactical and strategic planning, but also supernatural coordination that accommodated varying beliefs about celestial influence on warfare. The development of military engineering incorporated lunar considerations into the design of fortifications, siege equipment, and battlefield infrastructure. Medieval military engineers developed techniques for creating defensive and offensive capabilities that would function effectively during both normal conditions and lunar emergency periods. Military medical services had to accommodate beliefs about lunar influence on battlefield injuries and disease transmission. Army surgeons developed specialized procedures for treating wounds during different lunar phases, while military hospitals incorporated lunar timing into their patient care protocols. The recruitment and training of medieval armies required attention to lunar timing that was believed to affect both physical conditioning and military effectiveness. Some military units developed specialized training schedules that optimized soldier preparation according to lunar cycles and supernatural considerations. Military intelligence gathering incorporated lunar timing into reconnaissance and espionage activities. Medieval spies and scouts learned to coordinate their activities with the lunar phases that were believed to provide optimal conditions for gathering information while avoiding supernatural detection. The provisioning of medieval armies required elaborate systems for coordinating food supplies with lunar timing that was believed to affect both food preservation and the safety of supply operations. Military logistics incorporated astronomical calculations alongside traditional considerations about distance, terrain, and enemy activity. Military justice systems in medieval armies had to accommodate beliefs about lunar influence on soldier behavior and the effectiveness of military discipline. Court-martial proceedings incorporated considerations about lunar timing when evaluating charges related to desertion, cowardice, or insubordination during supernatural danger periods. The integration of civilian and military lunar beliefs created complex challenges for medieval kingdoms trying to coordinate defense efforts across diverse populations with varying supernatural traditions. Royal military policies had to accommodate local lunar beliefs while also maintaining effective centralized command structures. Military technology development was influenced by desires to create weapons and equipment that would function effectively during lunar supernatural emergencies. Medieval weaponsmiths developed specialized techniques for creating arms that were believed to provide protection against both human enemies and supernatural threats. The training of military officers incorporated education about lunar timing and supernatural warfare alongside traditional military subjects. Medieval military academies taught astronomical calculation and supernatural protection as essential skills for effective military leadership. Military architecture incorporated features designed to provide protection during lunar supernatural attacks alongside traditional defensive considerations. Castle designers developed specialized fortification techniques that accommodated both military and supernatural defensive requirements. The evolution of medieval military culture was significantly influenced by shared experiences of lunar warfare and supernatural battlefield encounters. Military traditions, ceremonies, and esprit de corps incorporated lunar elements that reinforced unit cohesion while also providing practical supernatural protection. International military cooperation required unprecedented coordination of lunar timing systems across different kingdoms, cultures, and religious traditions. Medieval military alliances involved not just political and strategic agreements, but also supernatural coordination that accommodated varying approaches to celestial timing. The economic costs of military lunar timing created additional financial pressures on medieval kingdoms, already struggling with the expenses of prolonged warfare. Military budgets had to accommodate the additional costs of astronomical consultation, protective materials, and operational delays caused by lunar considerations. The social impact of military lunar beliefs extended far beyond armies to affect civilian populations who had to accommodate military lunar timing requirements. Communities near military operations faced additional disruptions caused by supernatural military protocols that affected local economic and social activities. The psychological effects of combining military stress with lunar fears created unique challenges for medieval armies operating under extreme conditions. Military commanders had to manage not just traditional battlefield morale issues, but also supernatural anxieties that could affect unit effectiveness and soldier loyalty. The documentation of military lunar experiences contributed to the broader medieval understanding of supernatural warfare and celestial influence on human conflict. Military chronicles and records became important sources for transmission of lunar military knowledge across different regions and time periods. The legal frameworks that governed medieval warfare had to accommodate disputes and conflicts related to lunar timing and supernatural military practices. International laws of war incorporated considerations about lunar timing alongside traditional rules about combat conduct and prisoner treatment. The diplomatic protocols that managed medieval international relations required sophisticated understanding of different lunar timing systems and military supernatural practices. Diplomatic negotiations involved not just political and economic considerations, but also supernatural coordination that affected military cooperation and conflict resolution. The technological innovations that transformed late medieval warfare were often motivated by desires to improve lunar timing accuracy and supernatural military effectiveness. Astronomical instruments, calendar systems, and military technologies all served the complex needs of armies operating under celestial timing requirements. The educational institutions that trained medieval military leaders incorporated lunar studies into their curricula as essential knowledge for effective military command. Students learned astronomical calculation and supernatural warfare alongside traditional military arts and strategic planning. The religious institutions that provided spiritual support for medieval armies developed specialized liturgies and protective rituals designed to enhance military effectiveness during lunar operations. Military chaplains learned supernatural protection techniques alongside traditional pastoral care and battlefield ministry. The medical institutions that treated military casualties incorporated lunar timing into their therapeutic protocols, while also developing specialized knowledge about treating supernatural injuries and lunar-induced military conditions. Military medicine combined traditional wound care with supernatural healing techniques. The supply industries that equipped medieval armies developed specialized products and services designed to meet military lunar timing requirements. Military suppliers learned to coordinate their activities with astronomical calendars, while also providing protective materials and supernatural equipment. The transportation networks that supported medieval military operations required coordination of lunar timing across complex logistics systems involving multiple regions and cultural traditions. Military transportation incorporated astronomical considerations alongside traditional concerns about distance, terrain, and enemy interdiction. The communication systems that coordinated medieval military operations incorporated lunar timing into their message transmission protocols, while also accommodating the supernatural communication requirements of armies operating under celestial timing constraints. The intelligence networks that supported medieval military planning required sophisticated understanding of how lunar beliefs affected enemy capabilities and intentions. Military intelligence incorporated astronomical analysis alongside traditional reconnaissance and espionage activities. The financial institutions that funded medieval warfare developed specialized lending and insurance practices that accommodated the additional risks and costs associated with military lunar timing requirements. Military finance incorporated supernatural risk assessment alongside traditional economic analysis. The diplomatic institutions that manage medieval international relations required expertise in coordinating different lunar timing systems across multiple kingdoms and cultural traditions. International diplomacy incorporated astronomical negotiation alongside traditional political and economic discussions. The legal institutions that governed medieval warfare developed precedents and procedures for managing conflicts related to military lunar timing and supernatural warfare practices. Military justice incorporated celestial considerations alongside traditional rules about combat conduct and military discipline. The cultural institutions that preserved and transmitted medieval military knowledge incorporated lunar warfare traditions into their educational and commemorative activities. Military culture included supernatural elements alongside traditional martial values and battlefield experiences. The technological institutions that supported medieval military development incorporated lunar timing considerations into their research and innovation activities. Military technology incorporated astronomical requirements alongside traditional concerns about weapons effectiveness and battlefield utility. The gradual transformation of medieval military lunar beliefs reveals how warfare practices adapt to changing social, technological, and intellectual conditions while maintaining their essential functions in helping military organizations manage uncertainty and coordinate complex operations under dangerous conditions. The persistence of lunar timing in medieval warfare demonstrates how deeply embedded cultural practices can maintain their military functions, even as their supernatural justifications become increasingly questioned by military professionals and practical battlefield experience. Medieval military lunar beliefs created some of history's most sophisticated examples of integrating supernatural considerations into practical military operations, demonstrating how shared cultural beliefs can generate effective coordination mechanisms for complex organizational challenges even when their underlying assumptions may be questionable. Understanding medieval military lunar practices requires recognizing them as rational adaptations to genuine uncertainties inherent in warfare, rather than primitive mistakes, eventually corrected by improved military science and technology. The medieval integration of lunar beliefs with military practice reveals fundamental aspects of how military organizations create meaning, manage collective stress, and coordinate complex operations under conditions of extreme uncertainty and danger. The legacy of medieval military lunar practices extends beyond their specific supernatural content to demonstrate enduring principles about military organization, leadership, and cultural adaptation that remain relevant to contemporary challenges, requiring coordinated responses to complex and uncertain threats in military contexts. The fascinating thing about medieval lunar fears is how they created what modern historians call temporal anxiety, a cyclical dread that returned every 28 days, like clockwork. But these weren't just individual terrors whispered in dark corners. They became the foundation for entirely new forms of medieval scholarship that would influence European thought for centuries. Consider the rise of what medieval universities called celestial medicine, a sophisticated academic discipline that emerged in the 13th century. This wasn't folk healing passed down through oral tradition. This was formal medical education taught at institutions like the University of Bologna and the medical school at Montpellier. Students would spend months learning to calculate lunar influences on different parts of the human body, creating detailed anatomical charts that showed which organs were most vulnerable during specific moon phases. These medical lunar charts were works of art as much as science. Illuminated manuscripts from the period show intricate drawings of human figures surrounded by astronomical symbols, with lines connecting different body parts to corresponding celestial influences. The brain was always connected to the moon with elaborate decorative borders, emphasizing its supposed vulnerability to lunar madness. But here's what made medieval lunar medicine particularly sophisticated. It incorporated regional variations based on geographic location and local climate. A medical treatise written in northern Scotland would have different lunar timing recommendations than one produced in southern Italy, because medieval physicians believed that latitude affected how celestial influences manifested in human bodies. Medical schools developed standardized testing procedures for students learning lunar medicine. Examinations would include practical components, where students had to demonstrate their ability to calculate optimal timing for various medical procedures based on lunar calendars. Failing these astronomical portions of medical exams could prevent someone from receiving their medical degree, regardless of their knowledge of anatomy or herbal remedies. The economic implications were staggering. Medieval physicians who specialized in lunar medicine could command premium fees for their services, especially during full moon periods when demand for supernatural medical expertise peaked. Some doctors built their entire practices around lunar timing, traveling from town to town, offering specialized consultation services during dangerous celestial periods. But the most intriguing aspect of medieval lunar medicine was how it created international networks of scholarly exchange. Universities across Europe would share lunar medical manuscripts, compare regional variations in celestial timing, and debate theoretical questions about astronomical influences on human health. This created some of medieval Europe's first truly international academic communities. The development of mechanical timekeeping technology during the later medieval period revolutionized lunar medicine by allowing for more precise calculation of celestial timing. Clockmakers began producing specialized astronomical instruments designed specifically for medical use, creating a new luxury market for precision lunar timing devices. These medical astronomical instruments were incredibly expensive. A single lunar calculation device might cost more than a year's wages for a skilled craftsman. But wealthy physicians and noble households considered them essential investments for proper healthcare management. Some of these devices were so complex, they required specialized technicians to maintain and operate them. The legal profession also developed sophisticated lunar practices that went far beyond simple timing of court proceedings. Medieval legal scholars created detailed theories about how lunar influence affected human judgment and decision-making capacity. These theories had profound implications for concepts of legal responsibility and criminal culpability. Consider how medieval courts handled cases involving what they called lunar madness. If someone committed a crime during a full moon and claimed temporary insanity caused by celestial influence, how should justice be administered? Medieval legal authorities developed elaborate procedures for investigating such claims, including testimony from astronomical experts and medical examination of the defendant's supposed lunar sensitivity. Some medieval legal codes included formal provisions for celestial mitigation, reduced penalties for crimes committed during periods of intense lunar influence. This wasn't considered primitive superstition by medieval standards. It was sophisticated jurisprudence that took into account all factors that might affect human behavior and moral responsibility. The development of contract law was particularly affected by lunar considerations. Medieval merchants and financiers worried that agreements made during full moons might be invalid if one party was suffering from lunar-induced impaired judgment. Some contracts included specific clauses about lunar timing, while others required waiting periods to ensure that all parties were in their right minds when finalizing important agreements. Property law became incredibly complex when lunar timing was considered relevant to agricultural productivity and land values. If a harvest failed after being planted during an inauspicious lunar phase, who bore responsibility? The landowner who chose the timing, the tenant who performed the work, or neither party, since celestial forces were beyond human control? Medieval inheritance law grappled with questions about whether children conceived during certain lunar phases had different legal status or inheritance rights. Some legal authorities argued that lunar influence during conception could affect a child's mental capacity or spiritual condition, potentially impacting their ability to inherit property or titles. The emergence of specialized legal astrologers created entirely new professional categories within medieval society. These individuals combined legal training with astronomical expertise, serving as expert witnesses in court cases involving celestial timing disputes. Some achieved significant wealth and influence through their specialized knowledge of legal lunar interpretation. International trade law became phenomenally complicated when different regions had conflicting beliefs about optimal lunar timing for commercial activities. Merchants operating across multiple jurisdictions had to navigate not just different currencies and regulations, but also different astronomical legal requirements. The diplomatic corps that managed medieval international relations required extensive training in comparative lunar legal systems. Ambassadors needed to understand not just the political and economic interests of foreign kingdoms, but also their astronomical legal traditions and how celestial timing affected international agreement negotiations. Treaty negotiation became an exercise in astronomical diplomacy as much as political bargaining. Some international agreements took months longer to finalize because parties couldn't agree on appropriate lunar timing for treaty signing ceremonies. The symbolic importance of celestial timing in legitimizing international agreements created additional layers of complexity in medieval diplomacy. But perhaps the most sophisticated development in medieval lunar scholarship was the emergence of what modern historians call comparative celestial studies, academic programs that analyzed how different cultures understood and responded to lunar influence. Medieval universities began collecting manuscripts from Islamic, Byzantine, and even translated Chinese sources to compare astronomical traditions. This comparative approach revealed that while many cultures feared lunar influence, the specific details varied dramatically. Islamic astronomical texts described lunar effects that differed significantly from European beliefs, while Byzantine traditions incorporated elements from ancient Greek sources that had been lost in Western Europe. Medieval scholars began developing synthetic approaches that attempted to combine the best insights from multiple astronomical traditions. The translation movement that brought Islamic astronomical knowledge into European universities created intellectual revolutions in how lunar influence was understood. Arabic texts contained mathematical techniques for calculating lunar effects with far greater precision than existing European methods. Medieval scholars spent decades learning to adapt these foreign techniques to European conditions and beliefs. But this cross-cultural exchange also created theological tensions. How could Christian scholars incorporate astronomical knowledge from Islamic sources without compromising their religious beliefs? Medieval theologians developed elaborate theoretical frameworks for distinguishing between mathematical techniques that were religiously neutral and interpretive frameworks that might conflict with Christian doctrine. The development of medieval natural philosophy was profoundly influenced by these debates about lunar influence and religious orthodoxy. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas and Roger Bacon worked to create systematic approaches to natural knowledge that could accommodate astronomical observations while maintaining theological consistency. University curricula evolved to include formal training in what was called Christian astrology, astronomical study that was carefully distinguished from pagan fortune-telling or deterministic beliefs about celestial control over human destiny. Students learned to calculate lunar influences while maintaining that human free will and divine providence ultimately determined outcomes. The rise of medieval scholasticism created new intellectual frameworks for understanding lunar influence through systematic logical analysis. Scholastic philosophers applied rigorous logical methods to astronomical questions, creating elaborate theoretical systems that attempted to explain exactly how celestial forces affected earthly events. These scholastic astronomical theories were incredibly sophisticated, incorporating insights from Aristotelian physics, Ptolemaic astronomy, and Christian theology into comprehensive systems that could account for lunar influence while maintaining consistency with broader medieval worldviews. The logical complexity of these systems was often staggering. So there you have it. The medieval fear of the full moon wasn't just random superstition or primitive ignorance. It was a sophisticated cultural system built on medical theories, religious beliefs, and genuine environmental observations that made perfect sense within the medieval worldview. From Aristotelian theories about brain moisture to biblical prophecies about blood moons, from werewolf legends to lunar commercial practices, these beliefs shaped every aspect of medieval life for over 1,000 years. Understanding why our ancestors feared the moon helps us appreciate how human communities create meaning from uncertainty and organize collective responses to forces beyond their control. Next time you see a full moon, remember you're looking at something that once terrified entire civilizations. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.